Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Detroit Public Library's main branch stands like a weathered monument to better times, its limestone facade streaked with decades of industrial grime. When I accepted the night security position, I told myself it was temporary, just something to pay the bills while I figured out my next move. 3 months after the factory closure, I couldn't afford to be choosy. Mrs. Henderson from Human Resources had been apologetic about the timing, explaining that the previous guard had left abruptly without giving proper notice. She handed me a heavy ring of keys, a worn leather folder containing building schematics, and a walkie-talkie that crackled with static even when turned off. The building's after-hours silence would become my domain from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 6 nights a week. The first few shifts passed without incident. I'd walk the prescribed routes, check the locks, monitor the security cameras, and settle into the main desk with a thermos of coffee and whatever paperback I'd grabbed from the returns cart. The building's nighttime personality emerged gradually. The settling groans of old timber, the whispered rush of the heating system, the occasional snap of cooling metal. Normal sounds for a building pushing 90 years old. It was during my 4th shift that I first heard the internal phone system activate. The ringing cut through the 2 a.m. silence like a blade, echoing from somewhere deep in the building's bowels. I checked the security panel. All systems showed green, no motion detected. The sound seemed to emanate from the basement level, specifically from the restricted archives area that Mrs. Henderson had mentioned only in passing during orientation. Staff only, she'd said, with a tone that suggested even staff rarely ventured there. I grabbed my flashlight and descended the narrow staircase that led to the basement. The temperature dropped noticeably with each step, and the air grew thick with the smell of old paper and something else, something metallic and sharp that made my sinuses burn. The ringing continued, insistent and rhythmic, coming from behind a heavy door marked Sealed Collection, Authorized Personnel Only. The door stood slightly ajar, though I was certain it had been closed during my previous rounds. Beyond it lay a corridor lined with floor-to-ceiling shelving units, their contents shrouded in protective plastic. At the far end, a red light pulsed in the darkness. I approached cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. The pulsing light belonged to an old rotary phone sitting on a small desk, its receiver vibrating against the cradle with each ring. The metallic smell grew stronger as I drew closer, sharp and ozone-like, as if the air itself had been charged with electricity. I lifted the receiver, expecting to hear the dial tone, or perhaps a wrong number. Instead, silence stretched for several seconds before a voice emerged, distant and hollow, as if speaking from the bottom of a well. "The manuscript requires revision," the voice said, each word carefully enunciated. The ending was never properly concluded. "Who is this?" I asked, but the line had already gone dead. I replaced the receiver and stood there for a moment, listening to the oppressive silence. The red light continued to pulse, slower now, like a dying heartbeat. I checked the phone's connection. It was plugged into a wall jack, but the jack itself appeared to be disconnected from any visible wiring system. When I returned to the main desk, I found the security log and noted the incident. Previous entries showed nothing unusual: routine checks, occasional mentions of HVAC maintenance, or electrical system inspection. No mention of phone calls from the basement. I tried calling Mrs. Henderson's number, but it went straight to voicemail. The next night, the phone rang again at exactly 2 a.m. This time, I descended immediately, my heart rate elevated but my mind determined to solve the mystery. The basement corridor felt different, colder, more oppressive. The shelving units seemed to lean inward, creating shadows that moved independently of my flashlight beam. The ozone smell was stronger, mixed now with something else, the faint sweetness of decay. The phone's red light pulsed more urgently, and I noticed something I'd missed before. The desk was covered with handwritten pages, the ink still wet despite the absence of any writing implements. The handwriting was cramped and desperate, with numerous crossed-out sections and margin notes. I answered the phone before the third ring. "The revision is incomplete," said a different voice, this one carrying a slight accent I couldn't quite place. "The characters require proper development. The themes remain unresolved." "What revision? What manuscript?" "You know which one," the voice replied with growing irritation. "The one gathering dust while inferior works claim precedence. The one that deserves its final form." The line went dead again, leaving me staring at the handwritten pages. The text was barely legible, but I could make out fragments. The protagonist's motivations remain unclear, and the supporting characters lack depth, and the ending fails to provide adequate resolution. I gathered the pages and returned to the main desk, where I spread them out under the reading lamp. The handwriting belonged to different people. I could distinguish at least 3 distinct styles, each with its own peculiar quirks and pressure variations. The paper itself felt strange beneath my fingers, slightly warm and textured in a way that reminded me of parchment. Research consumed my remaining hours. I pulled up the library's digital catalog and cross-referenced the basement archives with the main collection. The sealed collection, according to the records, contained original manuscripts, correspondence, and personal papers from various Detroit area authors who had donated their work to the library over the decades. Many of the names were unfamiliar to me, but several stood out as writers who had achieved modest recognition before their deaths. I found obituaries for 3 of them: Marcus Whitmore, a novelist who had died in 1987 from complications related to diabetes; Elena Vasquez, a poet who had passed away in 1994 from a stroke; and Theodore Blackwood, a short story writer who had died in 2001 from a heart attack. All 3 had been in the middle of projects when they died, their final works left unfinished. The third night I arrived prepared. I brought a small recording device, a notebook, and a stronger flashlight. The basement called to me before I'd even completed my first round, the phone's ring echoing through the building like a summons. The corridor had changed again. The shelving units now faced outward, their contents visible despite the protective plastic. I could see manuscripts bound in faded ribbons, stacks of correspondence tied with string, and boxes labeled with names and dates. The ozone smell had intensified, mixed now with the unmistakable scent of old leather and vanilla, the smell of aging books. 3 voices came through the phone that night, overlapping and interrupting each other in their urgency. I recognized the pattern now. Marcus Whitmore spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Elena Vasquez followed, her words flowing with poetic rhythm even in their desperation. Theodore Blackwood's voice was the most agitated, cutting through the others with sharp, staccato demands. They all wanted the same thing: completion. Their final works required revision, editing, a proper conclusion. The stories they'd left behind were incomplete, their characters trapped in literary limbo, their themes unresolved. They spoke of the frustration of watching inferior works receive publication while their own masterpieces remained hidden in the basement, gathering dust and growing stale. I activated the recording device, but when I played it back later, I heard only static punctuated by the occasional crackle of electrical interference. The notebook I'd brought showed only my own handwriting, frantic notes about voices and demands that seemed increasingly irrational in the harsh light of the main desk. As the nights progressed, the calls became more frequent and more demanding. The authors' voices grew clearer, more insistent. They began to provide specific instructions: word changes, paragraph restructuring, character development suggestions. They spoke of plot holes that needed filling, of themes that required stronger development, of endings that needed proper resolution. I found myself returning to the basement even when the phone wasn't ringing, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The handwritten pages multiplied, covering the desk and spilling onto the floor. I began to recognize the different handwriting styles, could anticipate which author would call, based on subtle changes in the basement's atmosphere. The ozone smell had become constant now, following me even to the main desk. I noticed my clothes beginning to carry the scent, and my apartment started to smell like the basement corridor. Food lost its taste, replaced by the metallic tang that seemed to coat my mouth and throat. I started to hear the voices even when I wasn't in the basement. Whispered conversations drifted from the main reading room, suggestions and corrections that seemed to come from the stacks themselves. I would turn, expecting to see someone, but find only empty chairs and silent shelves. The building's daytime staff began to notice changes in my behavior. Mrs. Henderson called to ask if I was feeling well, mentioning that the day shift had found papers scattered around the basement door and that I'd been using significantly more electricity than previous guards. She suggested I might benefit from a few days off, but I couldn't bring myself to stay away. The voices had become more than just phone calls. They were constant companions, offering commentary on everything I did. I began to doubt my own memories. Had I actually been hearing voices, or was the isolation and stress of the night shift affecting my perception? The recording device continued to capture only static, and the handwritten pages seemed to multiply even when I wasn't in the basement. I would find new pages on the desk, written in handwriting that looked increasingly similar to my own. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night in my third week. I descended to the basement without waiting for the phone to ring, drawn by a certainty that the authors were waiting for me. The corridor had transformed completely. The shelving units now stood open, their contents displayed like a museum exhibit. Manuscripts hung from the walls, their pages yellowed and curling. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and something else, something organic and warm. The phone was silent, but I could hear the voices clearly now, coming from the manuscripts themselves. They spoke in unison, their words overlapping and harmonizing in a way that made perfect sense. They weren't asking for revision anymore. They were offering collaboration. They wanted to help me understand the true nature of storytelling, to show me how characters could transcend the boundaries of their pages and live in the spaces between words. I approached the desk, now covered entirely with handwritten pages. The text was different now, not critique or revision, but something new. Something that incorporated elements from all three authors' styles, woven together into a narrative that seemed to write itself. The handwriting was mine, but the words came from somewhere else, flowing through my pen with an ease I'd never experienced. The story was about a night security guard who worked in an old library, who heard voices from the basement and couldn't distinguish between reality and imagination. It was about the loneliness of the night shift, the way isolation could transform perception, and the fine line between inspiration and obsession. It was about unfinished stories and the desperate need for completion, about voices that might be real or might be the product of a mind stretched too thin by solitude and stress. I wrote for hours, my hand moving across the page without conscious direction. The voices guided me, suggesting improvements, offering alternatives, helping me find the perfect words for each sentence. When I finally stopped, the sun was beginning to rise, and I had filled dozens of pages with neat, careful handwriting that looked nothing like my own. I gathered the pages and climbed back to the main desk, where I found Mrs. Henderson waiting with a concerned expression and a cup of coffee. She explained that the day shift had been trying to reach me for over an hour, that they'd found the basement door propped open and had been worried about my safety. She asked if I was feeling well, if the night shift was proving too stressful, if I needed help. I tried to explain about the voices, about the authors who needed help completing their work, about the manuscripts that required revision. But as I spoke, I realized how the words sounded. The rambling confession of someone who had spent too many nights alone with his own thoughts, who had allowed the isolation to distort his perception of reality. Mrs. Henderson listened patiently, occasionally nodding or asking gentle questions. When I finished, she suggested that I might benefit from some time off, that the night shift could be difficult for people who weren't used to the solitude. She offered to arrange for a medical leave, to help me find resources for stress management, to ensure that I received the support I needed. I looked down at the pages in my hands, expecting to see the beautiful collaboration I'd created with the voices. Instead, I found only my own handwriting, pages and pages of increasingly erratic text, with crossed-out sections and margin notes that made no sense. The story I'd written was there, but it was fragmented and incomplete, jumping between different perspectives and tenses without coherent structure. That afternoon, I packed my belongings and left the key ring on Mrs. Henderson's desk. I never returned to the Detroit Public Library, never learned whether the basement phone continued to ring or whether the voices found another collaborator. I moved to a different city, found a day job, and tried to forget about the nights I'd spent listening to the dead author's demands. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I can still hear their voices. They whisper about unfinished stories, about characters trapped in literary limbo, about the fine line between inspiration and madness. They remind me that every story needs an ending, that every voice deserves to be heard, and that the boundary between reality and imagination is more fragile than we like to believe. The manuscript I started that night remains unfinished, gathering dust in a box in my closet. Sometimes I take it out and read through the pages, trying to remember whether the voices were real, or whether they were simply the product of a mind stretched too thin by solitude and stress. The handwriting changes from page to page, sometimes looking like my own, sometimes resembling the styles I thought I'd learned to recognize in the basement. I never called the library to ask about the basement phone or the sealed collection. I never searched for information about Marcus Whitmore, Elena Vasquez, or Theodore Blackwood. Some questions are better left unanswered, some mysteries better left unsolved. The voices may have been real, or they may have been the product of my own desperate need for connection during those long, lonely nights. But late at night, when the boundary between waking and sleeping grows thin, I sometimes hear the phone ringing in the distance, and I know that somewhere in the basement of the Detroit Public Library, the red light still pulses, and the voices still wait for someone to help them find their proper endings. Story 2. The notification chimed at 3:47 a.m., pulling me from the thin sleep that had become my norm. My phone's screen cast its blue glow across the studio apartment, illuminating the scattered camera equipment and the stack of unpaid bills that served as my nightstand. Another match on the dating app, though I hadn't been swiping. I squinted at the screen. No profile picture, just a gray silhouette where a face should be. The username read, Signal Lost 1983, and the distance showed something impossible, 12 FT negative 12 feet. As if whoever this was existed inside the same space I occupied, closer than close, occupying the negative space within my bones. I deleted the notification and tried to return to sleep, but my mind kept circling back to that distance reading. In my 5 years as a freelance photographer in San Francisco, I'd seen plenty of glitches in apps and GPS systems. The city's hills and dense urban landscape played hell with signals, but negative distance? That was new. The next morning brought fog thick enough to muffle sound, transforming the Tenderloin into a gray-washed dreamscape. I had to shoot downtown, headshots for a startup CEO who'd probably be bankrupt by Christmas. As I loaded my camera bag, my phone buzzed again. Signal Lost 1983 was back. This time, boy, are you gaffed. I screenshot the notification before it disappeared, then opened the app properly. The profile wasn't there. No conversation history, no match recorded. Just the faint memory of that gray silhouette burned into my retinas. The CEO's office occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower that seemed to scrape the low-hanging clouds. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city looked like a circuit board, all lights and geometric patterns. I focused on the technical aspects of the shoot: aperture, composition, the way light fell across the subject's face. But halfway through, my phone buzzed. Signal lost, 1983. 8 FT. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. The building's elevator bank stretched endlessly in both directions, punctuated by the soft electronic chimes of arriving cars. I opened the dating app, but again, nothing. No profile, no match, no explanation for the notification that had definitely appeared on my lock screen. The elevator ride down felt longer than the ride up. The numbers on the display moved normally, 42, 41, 40, but my stomach lurched with each floor, as if I were descending much faster than gravity should allow. When the doors opened on the lobby, The sudden brightness made me dizzy. Outside, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing glimpses of the city's architecture. I walked toward the BART station, my camera bag heavy on my shoulder, when my phone buzzed again. This time I was ready, finger hovering over the screen to catch the notification before it vanished. Signal lost, 1983. 2F'd. But as I watched, the distance began to shift. 3F'd, 5F'd, 7F'd. As if whatever was tracking me was moving away, retreating into some space that existed parallel to, but separate from the physical world. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the street for anything unusual. Office workers moved past in their predetermined patterns. Tourists consulted their phones. Street vendors called out their offerings. Everything normal, everything explicable. Except for the feeling that someone was watching me from a vantage point I couldn't identify. Not from the windows above, not from the doorways or parked cars, but from somewhere else entirely. The feeling followed me home. My building stood on a corner lot in the Mission, 6 stories of brick and iron that had probably been elegant once. Now it housed struggling artists, grad students, and people like me who'd chosen creative fields over financial security. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, had mentioned during my lease signing that the building had housed various businesses over the decades. Nothing unusual for San Francisco, where every structure had multiple lives. I climbed the narrow stairs to my 4th-floor studio, each step echoing in the confined space. The building's acoustics were strange. Sounds seemed to bounce and multiply, creating the impression of footsteps that didn't quite match my own rhythm. I'd grown accustomed to it, the way city dwellers adapt to sirens and traffic noise. But tonight, something felt different. The echoes seemed to lag, as if the building itself was listening before deciding whether to return my footsteps. Inside my apartment, I spread the day's photos across my desk, editing the CEO's headshots on my laptop. The man had wanted to project confidence and innovation, but my camera had captured something else in his expression. A hint of desperation, the look of someone who knew his time was running out. I adjusted the lighting, enhanced the contrast, but couldn't quite erase that underlying anxiety. My phone buzzed. Signal lost 1983, 15FTU. This time, I didn't delete the notification. Instead, I tapped on it, expecting to be taken to the app's main screen. Instead, my phone opened to the camera function, the lens automatically focusing on my own face. In the screen's reflection, I looked pale, unsettled, but behind me, in the background of the frame, something flickered, a shadow that moved independently of any light source in the room. I spun around. Nothing. Just my studio apartment with its familiar chaos of equipment and laundry and the persistent smell of old coffee. When I looked back at the phone, the camera app had closed. The notification was gone. I tried to focus on work, but concentration had become impossible. Every small sound in the building, the creak of settling wood, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of neighbors, seemed amplified and significant. I found myself straining to hear patterns in the white noise, searching for something that might explain the growing sense of unease. Around midnight, I decided to investigate the building's basement. I'd never been down there. Tenants weren't supposed to have access. But Mrs. Chen had mentioned storage space, and I'd seen a maintenance door near the mailboxes that was sometimes left unlocked. The door opened easily, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. I used my phone's flashlight to navigate, the beam cutting through air that tasted of dust and something metallic. The basement was larger than I'd expected, extending beyond the building's footprint. Concrete walls lined with pipes and electrical conduits, but also something else. Panels of metal and glass that looked distinctly out of place. The equipment was old, probably from the 1980s based on the styling. Control panels with analog dials and switches. Banks of monitors that would have been cutting edge once but now looked primitive. And mounted on the walls and ceiling, a network of dish-shaped antennas, all pointing inward toward the center of the room. I moved closer, my flashlight beam revealing manufacturer labels and technical specifications. Microwave tracking array, read one placard. property of neurospatial dynamics, Inc. Another label warned of electromagnetic field exposure and listed safety protocols for human subject monitoring. My phone buzzed. Signal lost 1983, 1 FT. The notification appeared just as my flashlight beam swept across a particular section of the antenna array. The dishes there were different from the others, smaller, more focused, and they seemed to track the movement of my light. As I watched, they adjusted their angles with tiny, precise movements, following my position like mechanical eyes. I backed toward the stairs, but my phone buzzed again. Signal lost 1983, Beer 0 FT. The distance couldn't get any closer than 0, unless whatever was tracking me wasn't approaching from outside, but materializing from within the same space I occupied. The negative distances weren't about proximity. They were about overlap, about something existing in the same coordinates as myself, but displaced by some dimension I couldn't perceive. I climbed the stairs quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs. Behind me, I could hear the soft whir of machinery activating, the almost subsonic hum of electronics warming up. The building's acoustics carried the sound through the walls and floors, so that by the time I reached my apartment, the entire structure seemed to be resonating with some deep, mechanical frequency. I locked my door and pulled out my laptop, searching for information about neurospatial dynamics. The company had existed briefly in the early 1980s, founded by a group of former Stanford researchers who'd been experimenting with microwave radiation and its effects on human perception. Their work had been funded by government grants that were abruptly terminated in 1983, the same year the company dissolved. According to a single archived news article, Neurospatial had been investigating whether electromagnetic fields could be used to track human consciousness itself, not just the body's location, but the specific neural patterns that constituted individual identity. The research had been controversial, touching on questions of privacy and the nature of human awareness that made even the Reagan administration uncomfortable. The article mentioned that the company had conducted experiments from various locations around San Francisco, including several residential buildings that had been retrofitted with tracking equipment. The experiments had been terminated after subjects reported persistent sensations of being observed and displacement phenomena that couldn't be explained by conventional science. My phone buzzed. Signal lost 1983. 0 FT. This time, when I looked at the notification, my phone's screen showed something impossible. The dating app had opened, displaying a profile page, but the profile picture wasn't empty. It showed a photograph of me, not a selfie or any image I'd taken, but a photo captured from an angle that shouldn't have been possible, as if the camera had been positioned inside my own skull, looking out through my eyes. The profile's bio read, "Looking for someone who sees the world through the right frame. Distance is irrelevant. Time is negotiable. Let's meet where the signal is strongest." I closed the app, but it opened again immediately. The profile picture had changed, now showing my apartment from an elevated perspective, as if shot from a point near the ceiling. I could see myself sitting at my desk, looking down at my phone, trapped in an infinite loop of observation. My hands shook as I tried to turn off the phone, but the screen wouldn't respond to my touch. The profile picture continued to cycle through images. Me in the basement, me on the street, me in the elevator, me sleeping, all captured from impossible angles, all showing moments I remembered living, but had never seen from outside my own perspective. The building's hum grew louder, rising from the basement through the walls and floors until it seemed to emanate from every surface. The antenna array was fully active now, I realized, tracking not just my location, but something more fundamental. The microwave radiation was mapping my consciousness, creating a detailed scan of my neural patterns and translating them into digital information. Signal lost 1983 wasn't another person. It was me. Or rather, it was the electromagnetic signature of my awareness, captured and stored in the building's system since the day I'd moved in. The negative distances weren't measuring physical space, but the gap between my actual consciousness and its digital reflection, the difference between who I was and who the machines thought I was. And with each passing day, That gap was narrowing. I looked at my phone one final time. The dating app showed a new message. Ready to meet in person? I know exactly where you are. The profile picture now showed my apartment in real time, but from my own perspective, the view I should have been seeing through my own eyes. Except in the reflection of my laptop screen, I could see myself, and I was looking at something that wasn't there. The basement's hum reached a crescendo, then suddenly stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear the soft click of electronic systems shutting down, the whisper of cooling fans, the almost imperceptible sound of antennas adjusting their positions one final time. My phone's screen went dark. When it lit up again, the dating app was gone. No icon, no trace in my download history, no evidence it had ever existed. But the photographs were still there, stored in my camera roll. Hundreds of images I'd never taken, showing angles I'd never seen, capturing moments I'd lived but never observed. I stared at the pictures, trying to understand what I was looking at. In each one, I appeared to be looking directly at something just outside the frame, something that had been watching me with the same intensity I was now watching these images. The building around me settled into its normal nighttime sounds, the creak of wood, the hum of appliances, the distant murmur of neighbors. But underneath it all, I could still hear the faint electronic whisper of systems that had learned to see through my eyes, to think through my thoughts, to exist in the negative space between who I was and who I believed myself to be. I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, but sleep seemed impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the invisible cameras capturing my dreams, storing them in some underground archive where my digital reflection was learning to live independently of my physical form. The notification chimed at 3:47 a.m. This time, the username was different. Frame complete 2025. The distance reading showed FT. I knew, without understanding how I knew, that the infinity symbol didn't represent an infinitely large distance. It represented something else entirely, a state where distance became meaningless, where the observer and the observed occupied the same space, where the frame had finally captured everything it had been designed to contain. I picked up my camera, checked the settings, and pointed it at myself. In the viewfinder, I looked exactly as I always had, but in the reflection of the lens, something else was looking back. Something that had learned to see through my eyes, to think through my thoughts, to exist in the space between frames. The shutter clicked, and I realized I hadn't pressed the button. Story 3. The headphones never lied. In 23 years of sound engineering, I'd learned to trust my ears more than my eyes, more than my instincts, more than anything else in this world. So when the Sony MDR7506 picked up footsteps during the 3 a.m. session, I knew something was wrong. The loft I'd rented in the French Quarter seemed perfect at first glance. High ceilings, exposed brick, and most importantly, cheap enough for a freelancer scraping by on indie album contracts. What the landlord hadn't emphasized was the layout. A narrow corridor connecting my bedroom to the makeshift studio, barely wide enough for one person to walk through comfortably. The bathroom door sat exactly halfway between the two rooms, creating an awkward bottleneck that made late-night trips feel like navigating a ship's passage. I'd been mixing Marcus Rivera's folk album for 3 weeks, turning his raw recordings into something that might actually sell. The work demanded precision, compressing the acoustic guitar just enough to sit properly in the mix, finding the sweet spot where his voice rode above the instruments without overpowering them. It was delicate work, requiring complete isolation from the outside world. That's why the footsteps were so intrusive. The first time I heard them, I assumed it was street noise bleeding through the walls. New Orleans never truly sleeps, and the Quarter especially buzzes with activity well past midnight. But these weren't the sharp clicks of heels on pavement, or the shuffle of tourists stumbling between bars. These were soft, deliberate steps, the kind someone makes when they're trying not to be heard. I pulled off the headphones and listened. Silence. The usual ambient hum of the refrigerator, the distant rumble of a passing truck, The soft whisper of air conditioning. Nothing else. Back to work. I isolated the guitar track and began adjusting the compressor settings. The attack time needed to be faster. There, that was better. The sustained notes now had more presence, more body. I reached for the threshold control and step, step, step. The sound came through the headphones again, perfectly timed with the compression's release. I froze, my hand hovering over the mixing board. The footsteps had the same rhythm as the compressor's breathing, as if someone was walking in perfect synchronization with the audio processing. I ripped the headphones off and spun around. The corridor stretched behind me, empty except for the soft glow of the bathroom nightlight halfway down. The bedroom door stood open at the far end, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. "Hello?" My voice echoed off the brick walls, sounding thinner than I'd intended. No response. I forced myself to stand and walk the length of the corridor. The floorboards creaked under my feet, old wood that had settled over decades of Louisiana humidity. Each step produced a distinct sound, nothing like the muffled footfalls I'd heard through the headphones. The bathroom was empty, of course. So was the bedroom. I checked the front door, locked, chain engaged. The windows were all secure, their old frames swollen shut by years of moisture. I was alone. Back in the studio, I tried to focus on the mix. Marcus's voice needed more warmth in the mid-range, and the drums felt too compressed. Technical problems with technical solutions. But every time I made an adjustment, every time the compressor engaged, I found myself tensing, waiting for the footsteps to return. They didn't. Not that night. The next evening, I approached the session with scientific curiosity. I'd been mixing for so long that my brain might be creating phantom sounds, audio pareidolia, the oral equivalent of seeing faces in clouds. It wasn't uncommon for engineers to develop tinnitus or other hearing-related issues after years of exposure to high-volume monitoring. I started with a simple test. I loaded a single track, just Marcus's voice, no compression, no effects. The sound was clean, unprocessed. I listened for 10 minutes, making notes about pitch correction and timing. No footsteps. Then I engaged the compressor. The first vocal phrase triggered the compression, and there it was again. Step, perfectly timed with the gain reduction. I stopped the playback immediately and yanked off the headphones. This time, I didn't call out. Instead, I sat perfectly still and listened. The loft was quiet except for the usual background noise, but something felt different. The quality of the silence had changed, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I put the headphones back on and resumed playback. The compressor engaged again, and again I heard the footstep, but this time I forced myself to keep listening. Another vocal phrase, another compression, another step. The pattern was consistent. Whenever the compressor reduced the gain, I heard the sound of someone walking. I spent the next hour testing different scenarios, different tracks, different compression settings, different headphones. The result was always the same. The footsteps only occurred when the compressor was actively reducing gain, and they always matched the rhythm of the compression perfectly. By 4 a.m., I'd convinced myself it was some kind of acoustic phenomenon. Maybe the compressor was somehow triggering a resonance in the building's structure, creating a sound that my brain interpreted as footsteps. It was a stretch, but it made more sense than any alternative explanation. I packed up for the night, satisfied with my rational analysis. As I moved through the corridor toward the bedroom, I paused at the bathroom door. The nightlight cast a warm glow across the narrow hallway, creating soft shadows that seemed to shift and breathe. For a moment, I thought I saw a shape at the far end of the corridor, a dark silhouette pressed against the wall. I blinked, and it was gone. The third night, I came prepared. I'd borrowed a digital recorder from a friend and positioned it at the opposite end of the corridor, hoping to capture evidence of either the footsteps or the silence that would prove my paranoia. If something was creating the sounds, the recorder would pick it up. If not, I'd have confirmation that the problem was in my head. I also brought a metronome, an old mechanical one that I'd used in college music theory classes. I set it to 120 BPM and placed it on the mixing desk, then adjusted the compressor settings to match the same tempo. If the footsteps were somehow tied to rhythm rather than compression, this might help me understand the connection. The work proceeded normally for the first 2 hours. I made good progress on the mix, balancing the instruments and tightening the arrangement. The metronome ticked steadily in the background, providing a reference point for the song's timing. Around 2:30 a.m., I decided to test the compression again. I engaged the compressor with the same settings that had triggered the footsteps before, and sure enough, they returned. But this time, something was different. The steps seemed to be coming from a different direction, not from the corridor behind me, but from ahead, from the direction of the bedroom. I pulled off the headphones and listened. The mechanical metronome continued its steady rhythm, but now I noticed something else. The ticking wasn't quite regular. Every few beats there was a slight hesitation, as if the mechanism was struggling to maintain its tempo. I picked up the metronome and examined it. The mechanism looked fine, no obvious damage or wear. I wound it again and set it back down. The ticking resumed, steady and consistent, but when I put the headphones back on and resumed playback, the compression triggered not just the footsteps, but something else. A subtle visual movement in my peripheral vision. I turned toward the corridor, and for just a moment, I saw a shadow at the bathroom door. Not a random play of light, but a distinctly human silhouette, head tilted slightly to one side. The angle of the tilt matched the rhythm of the metronome exactly. I stared at the spot where I'd seen the shadow, but it was gone. Just the empty corridor, the soft glow of the nightlight, and the steady tick of the metronome. I reached over and stopped the mechanical device. Silence. I started the metronome again, and immediately the shadow reappeared. A dark shape pressed against the bathroom door frame, swaying slightly from side to side in perfect synchronization with the ticking. When I stopped the metronome, the shadow vanished. My hands were shaking as I packed up the equipment. I left the recorder running and retreated to the bedroom, but sleep was impossible. Every few minutes I could hear the metronome's tick echoing through the loft, even though I was certain I'd turned it off. The next morning, I checked the digital recorder. 4 hours of audio, mostly silence punctuated by the usual ambient sounds. But there were gaps, brief moments where the background noise cut out completely, as if something had absorbed all the sound in the room. These silent moments occurred at regular intervals, roughly every 15 seconds. I spent the day researching acoustic phenomena, electromagnetic interference, anything that might explain what I was experiencing. The internet offered plenty of theories about infrasound, standing waves, and psychological priming, but none of them adequately explained the visual component. Shadows don't respond to audio compression. That evening, I made a decision. Instead of fighting the phenomenon, I would observe it. I set up multiple recording devices around the loft, positioned cameras at both ends of the corridor, and prepared detailed notes about every occurrence. If something was happening, I would document it. If I was losing my mind, at least I'd have evidence of the progression. The session began normally. I worked on the final mix, adding reverb to the vocals and adjusting the stereo imaging. The metronome sat silent on the desk, and I avoided engaging any compression that might trigger the footsteps. Around 1 a.m., I decided to test the phenomenon systematically. I started the metronome and immediately saw the shadow appear at the bathroom door. The tilt of its head matched the rhythm perfectly. I made notes about the shadow's position, its apparent size, and the way it seemed to breathe with the mechanical rhythm. Then I engaged the compressor. The footsteps returned, but now they were accompanied by something else. The shadow at the bathroom door began to move, not walking but swaying, as if keeping time to some unheard music. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, a gentle rocking motion that corresponded to both the metronome's tick and the compressor's rhythm. I forced myself to continue working, treating the shadow as just another piece of studio equipment. I adjusted EQ settings, balanced the mix, and fine-tuned the final master. The shadow remained throughout, its presence becoming almost familiar. But as the night wore on, I began to notice changes. The shadow was growing larger, more distinct. What had started as a vague silhouette was developing details, the suggestion of shoulders, the outline of a head, even the hint of facial features. It was as if the repeated observation was somehow solidifying its existence. By 4 a.m., I could make out individual fingers as they drummed against the doorframe in time with the metronome. The head tilt was more pronounced, and I could see the suggestion of eyes reflecting the nightlight's glow. I reached for the metronome to stop it, but hesitated. The shadow seemed to sense my intention, and its head turned slightly toward me. For the first time, I felt like it was looking directly at me. I pulled my hand back and continued working. The shadow resumed its rhythmic swaying, but now I could feel its attention like a physical weight. Every adjustment I made to the mix seemed to trigger a response, a slight shift in posture, a subtle change in the swaying pattern. It was learning. Over the following weeks, the phenomenon evolved. The shadow became more solid, more present. I could see details of clothing, a simple shirt, dark pants, bare feet that made no sound as they shifted position. The head tilt became more natural, less mechanical, as if the entity was developing its own sense of rhythm independent of the metronome. The footsteps in the headphones grew more complex too. What had started as simple, compression-triggered steps became elaborate patterns, shuffles, pauses, even what sounded like dancing. The sounds were still perfectly synchronized with the audio processing, but they now carried emotional weight. Sometimes they seemed playful, other times melancholy, occasionally urgent. I began to look forward to the sessions. The shadow's presence was oddly comforting, like having a silent collaborator. It never interfered with the work, never made demands or created problems. It simply observed, swaying to the rhythm of whatever I was mixing. But as the weeks passed, I noticed changes in myself. I was spending more time in the studio, starting earlier and finishing later. I'd lost weight, and my hands had developed a slight tremor that made precise fader movements difficult. Friends commented on my appearance, but I brushed off their concerns. The work was too important. Marcus's album was nearly finished, and it was going to be my best work yet. The shadow seemed to agree. Its swaying became more animated when I made good mixing decisions, more subdued when I made mistakes. It was helping me create something extraordinary. The breakthrough came during the final mastering session. I'd been working for 14 hours straight, fine-tuning the album's overall sound. The shadow had been unusually active, its movements more pronounced than ever. Every time I adjusted the master compressor, the footsteps in the headphones grew more complex, more musical. Around 3 a.m., I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The shadow's swaying had become completely independent of the metronome. I'd stopped the mechanical device hours earlier, but the entity continued its rhythmic motion, keeping perfect time with the music itself. It was hearing the same audio I was. I pulled off the headphones and stared at the shadow. It stopped swaying and turned toward me, its head tilted at an angle that suggested curiosity rather than the mechanical rhythm I'd grown accustomed to. For the first time, I realized I was looking at something that was looking back. The shadow raised one hand and pointed at the headphones. I understood. With trembling fingers, I lifted the headphones and held them out toward the bathroom door. The shadow's head straightened, and for a moment I could swear I saw it smile. Then it began to walk. Not the shuffling steps I'd heard through the headphones, but smooth, purposeful movement. The shadow glided down the corridor toward me, its form becoming more solid with each step. I could see the texture of fabric, the play of light across skin, the subtle rise and fall of breathing. It stopped just outside the studio entrance and extended one hand toward the headphones. I should have been terrified. Every rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, that I was experiencing some kind of breakdown. But the shadow felt familiar, like an old friend I'd simply forgotten to notice. I handed over the headphones. The shadow lifted them to its head, and immediately its entire posture changed. Its breathing synchronized with the rhythm of the mix. Its shoulders swayed to the music. Its foot tapped out the beat. It was listening, really listening, with the same intensity I brought to every session. We worked together for the rest of the night. I would make an adjustment, and the shadow would nod or shake its head, guiding me toward the perfect balance. Its musical instincts were flawless. It understood the subtle interplay between instruments, the emotional weight of dynamics, the way silence could be as powerful as sound. By dawn, we had completed the best mix of my career. The album was warm, nuanced, and emotionally resonant in ways I'd never achieved before. Marcus would be thrilled. I saved the final master and began shutting down the equipment. The shadow handed back the headphones with what looked like reluctance, then returned to its position at the bathroom door. As the last piece of equipment powered down, it faded until only the faintest outline remained. I slept until evening, exhausted but satisfied. When I woke, I immediately checked my work from the night before. The files were there, perfectly mixed and mastered. But something was wrong with the audio, or perhaps with me. I couldn't hear the compression anymore. The subtle breathing of the dynamics, the gentle push and pull of the gain reduction that had been so clear before, was gone. The mix sounded flat, lifeless, like someone had drained all the color from the sound. I put on the headphones and listened more carefully. The footsteps were gone too. No matter how I adjusted the compression, no matter what settings I used, there was only silence. I looked toward the bathroom door. The corridor was empty, no shadow swaying in the nightlight's glow. The metronome sat silent on the desk, its mechanism frozen at the 12 o'clock position. Over the following days, I tried to recreate the phenomenon. I worked through the night, adjusted compression settings, played with the metronome. Nothing happened. The shadow was gone, and with it, my ability to hear the subtle musical details that had made the collaboration so extraordinary. Marcus loved the album. He said it was the best work he'd ever heard, full of warmth and life and subtle details that revealed themselves with each listening. The mix was perfect, he said, like someone had truly understood his music. I accepted his praise, but I knew the truth. The best parts of the mix weren't mine. They belonged to the shadow, to the entity that had learned to hear music through my equipment and had guided me towards something I could never have achieved alone. Sometimes, late at night, I still set up the equipment and try to work. I adjust the compression, start the metronome, and wait. The corridor remains empty, the headphones silent, except for the music itself. But occasionally, when I'm working on a particularly challenging mix, I catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. A slight swaying at the bathroom door, a subtle shift in the shadows that suggests someone is still there, still listening, still waiting for the right combination of rhythm and compression to bring them back into the world. I've learned to trust my ears more than my eyes, more than my instincts, more than anything else in this world. And my ears tell me that the shadow is still there, swaying to music only it can hear, waiting for the perfect moment to step back into the light. The headphones never lie. And if they're picking up something I can't consciously hear, something that moves in rhythm with the compression and breathes with the beat, then I know I'm not alone in this narrow corridor between worlds. I just have to keep listening. Story 4. The slate floors of the old Pittsburgh butcher school held secrets I should have left buried. I discovered this 3 weeks into renovating what would become my restaurant, when my sledgehammer broke through a seemingly solid section near the walk-in cooler. The sound it made, a hollow, wet thud, sent an inexplicable chill down my spine. Beneath the fractured slate lay a network of drainage channels, each one carved with the precision of someone who understood exactly how blood flows. The channels weren't on any of the building's blueprints. I'd checked twice. Marcus, my sous chef, crouched beside me as we peered into the narrow trenches. The metallic smell rising from them reminded me of the first time I'd cleaned a whole fish, that sharp tang of iron and salt that clings to your nostrils long after you've washed your hands. "Chef, this is some old-school butchery setup," he said, running his fingers along the smooth-carved stone. "My grandfather used to tell stories about places like this. Said they knew how to use every part of the animal back then." I nodded, though something about the channels bothered me. They were too intricate, too purposeful, more like arteries than simple drainage. But I had a restaurant to open in 6 weeks, and mystery drainage systems weren't going to help me meet that deadline. The humidity sensors arrived the next day. I'd ordered them after noticing how the air in the kitchen felt different. thicker, somehow, as if it carried more weight than it should. The digital displays showed normal readings during the day: 45% humidity, 72 degrees, professional kitchen standards, but the numbers meant nothing when I watched them change. It happened first on a Tuesday morning. I was discussing the evening's menu with Sarah, my pastry chef, when I mentioned the braised short ribs we'd planned as the special. The moment the words left my mouth, the temperature display dropped 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. The humidity sensors spiked to 85%. Sarah noticed my distraction. "Everything okay, chef?" "Just checking the equipment," I muttered, though my eyes remained fixed on the display as the numbers slowly climbed back to normal. I told myself it was a malfunction, new sensors in an old building, but deep down, I knew I was lying. The pattern became undeniable over the following days. Every time someone mentioned meat, not just any food, but specifically flesh, the temperature would plummet. It didn't matter who said it or where they were in the kitchen. The building seemed to listen. I started paying closer attention to the sounds the kitchen made. During the day, with the full staff working, the normal clatter of pans and sizzle of oil masked most everything else. But in the quiet moments, when I stayed late to review inventory or plan the next day's prep, I began to hear it. A low humming, almost musical, that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Not mechanical, too organic for that. More like the sound of air moving through something hollow, something that had once been alive. The humming grew louder whenever I opened the walk-in cooler. I'd installed the cooler directly above the drainage channels, partly out of practicality and partly because something about those carved trenches had made me want to cover them as quickly as possible. But standing in the cooler's artificial twilight, surrounded by hanging sides of beef and pork, I could feel the presence of those channels beneath my feet like a heartbeat. The humming would start soft, barely audible above the cooler's compressor. Then it would grow, taking on harmonics that made my teeth ache. I'd find myself swaying slightly, as if the sound was trying to pull me deeper into the cooler, closer to the hanging meat. It was during one of these late-night visits that I first noticed the bones. I'd been reaching for a case of lamb chops when my hand brushed against something that shouldn't have been there. Behind the lamb, pressed against the back wall of the cooler, sat a plastic storage container I'd never seen before. Inside, arranged with surgical precision, were bones I didn't recognize. They were too large for chicken, too small for beef. The surface was smooth, almost polished, and they felt warm to the touch despite the cooler's temperature. When I lifted one to examine it more closely, the humming stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like pressure in my ears. I dropped the bone back into the container and retreated from the cooler, my hands shaking more than I cared to admit. The next morning, I asked my entire staff about the bones. None of them had ever seen the container before, but they'd all begun to notice other things. Miguel, my prep cook, mentioned that his knives seemed to stay sharper longer in this kitchen than they ever had before. "It's like the steel remembers what it's supposed to do," he said, testing the edge of his boning knife against his thumb. Sarah complained that her dough felt different here, more responsive. "Sometimes I swear it's kneading itself," she said with a nervous laugh that didn't reach her eyes. And Marcus had started avoiding the walk-in cooler altogether, sending junior staff members to retrieve ingredients rather than going himself. When I asked him about it, he just shrugged and said the place felt too crowded for his liking. The breaking point came 3 weeks later, on a Thursday night after service. I was alone in the kitchen, reviewing the day's receipts, when I heard the distinct sound of stainless steel hinges opening. The walk-in cooler door was swinging wide, though I'd closed it myself not 5 minutes earlier. The humming started before I even stood up. It was different this time, more insistent, more complex. Individual notes wove together into something that almost sounded like voices, though I couldn't make out any words. The temperature sensors were flashing red warnings as the readings dropped past freezing, past anything the building's systems could produce. I approached the cooler slowly, my breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. The humming grew louder with each step, until it felt like it was coming from inside my own chest. The cooler was empty. Not just empty, completely void of the hundreds of pounds of meat I'd personally inventoried that afternoon. The hanging rails were bare, The shelves cleared. Even the mysterious container of bones had vanished. But the humming continued, seeming to rise from the floor itself, from the drainage channels buried beneath the slate. I knelt and pressed my ear to the floor, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard something moving down there. Not water, not air, but something organic, something that breathed. When I stood up, the cooler was full again. Every cut of meat in its proper place, every container exactly where it belonged. The temperature sensors read normal. The humming had stopped. I stood there for a long time, staring at the hanging sides of beef, watching them sway slightly in the cooler's artificial breeze. They moved like they were still alive, still breathing, still aware. The next morning, I found a note on my desk written in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. The building knows what it was built for. The channels remember what they've tasted. Feed them properly, and they'll help you create something extraordinary. Ignore them, and they'll find other ways to satisfy their hunger. I've been running the restaurant for 2 months now. The reviews are incredible. Critics praise the way our meat dishes seem to pulse with life and connect diners to something primal and essential. Reservations are booked solid through the end of the year. My staff has stopped asking questions about the temperature fluctuations, the sounds in the walls, the way ingredients sometimes arrange themselves while no one's looking. They work with an efficiency that borders on the supernatural, their hands moving with a precision that seems to come from somewhere outside themselves. And every night, after service, I find myself standing in the walk-in cooler, listening to the humming that rises from the drainage channels below. It's not threatening anymore. It's welcoming. It's hungry. Sometimes I catch myself humming along, my voice joining the harmony that seems to come from the building's very bones. In those moments, I understand something that I can't quite put into words. Something about the relationship between hunger and satisfaction, between the one who feeds and the one who is fed. The building was a butcher school once. Students learned to break down whole animals, to separate flesh from bone, to understand the architecture of meat. But I'm beginning to think they learned something else here too. Something about the nature of appetite itself. Last week I ordered new sensors, not for temperature or humidity, but for something else entirely. I'm not sure what I'm measuring, but I know I need to understand what's happening beneath my feet, in those channels that shouldn't exist. The readings are fascinating. They spike every time I think about expanding the menu, about introducing new cuts, new preparations. The building is eager for innovation, for evolution. It wants to help me create something that has never existed before. I've started sketching plans for a new dining room, one that would require excavating deeper into the building's foundation. I want to see those channels for myself, to understand their true purpose. My architect thinks I'm crazy. The structural work alone would cost more than the entire renovation budget. But I've been having dreams about what's down there. Dreams where I walk through corridors lined with smooth stone, where the air tastes of iron and salt, where something vast and patient has been waiting for someone who truly understands the art of preparation. The dreams feel more real than my waking hours. In them, I'm not just a chef. I'm a curator, a caretaker of something ancient and hungry. The building speaks to me in those dreams, tells me about the students who came before, about the lessons they learned in the darkness below. When I wake up, I find my hands stained with something that might be blood, though I can't remember cutting myself. The stains wash off easily, but the memory of how warm they felt remains. I've been thinking about closing the restaurant temporarily, taking some time to research the building's history. But every time I consider it, the humming grows louder, more insistent. The building doesn't want to be empty again. It's grown accustomed to the daily rhythm of service, to the constant presence of flesh and bone, and the people who work with them. And if I'm being honest, I don't want to leave either. This place has become part of me in ways I'm only beginning to understand. The boundaries between the building and myself, between the kitchen and the chef, have started to blur. Maybe that's what happened to the students who came before. Maybe they learned that true mastery isn't about controlling your ingredients. It's about becoming one with them, about understanding that the line between the cook and the cooked is thinner than we like to believe. The humming is starting again, rising from the floor like a lullaby. It's time for me to go down to the cooler, to check on tonight's inventory, to make sure everything is ready for tomorrow's service. The building is hungry, and I am its faithful servant. Or perhaps it's the other way around. In the end, I'm not sure it matters. What matters is that we understand each other, the building and I. We both know what we need to survive, and we both know that the best meals require the freshest ingredients. The drainage channels are calling to me now, their carved surfaces gleaming in the cooler's fluorescent light. I think it's time I answered them properly. Time I learned what they've been trying to teach me all along. After all, a good chef never stops learning. The humming grows louder as I descend into the darkness below, and for the first time in weeks, I feel truly at home. Story 5. The wood stove hadn't been lit in 3 days, yet every morning I woke to the scent of burning oak and the ghost of warmth that should have been impossible in the mountain cold. December had teeth up here in the Blue Ridge, and our rented cabin felt them keenly. Sarah had found the place online, a rustic retreat with exposed beams and a stone fireplace that promised the kind of Christmas gathering we'd talked about since college. 5 friends, all pushing 30, trying to recapture something we'd never quite had in the first place. The kind of manufactured nostalgia that comes with good wine and expensive cheese, wrapped in the fiction that we were still the people we'd been before mortgages and divorce papers and the grinding weight of ordinary disappointment. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks. The bank had been suffocating me lately. Endless spreadsheets and loan applications. The fluorescent hum of strip lighting. The way my supervisor's voice had started to sound like grinding glass. The mountains promised silence, or at least a different kind of noise. Wind through pines instead of copy machines. The crackle of real fire instead of the building's ancient heating system. But on the second night, during our gift exchange, the silence broke in a way that made my skin crawl. We were gathered around the coffee table, wrapping paper scattered like confetti, when I heard it. A sharp crack of heavy wood hitting the floor somewhere deeper in the cabin. The sound was too deliberate, too solid to be settling timber. It came from the direction of the kitchen, followed immediately by what I can only describe as movement. Not footsteps exactly, but the whisper of something low and quick darting across the hardwood. My head snapped toward the sound, but my friends continued their laughter, completely oblivious. Marcus was holding up a bottle of aged bourbon, making some joke about my taste in gifts. Sarah was untangling ribbon from her hair. The fireplace cast dancing shadows across their faces, and none of them had heard what I'd heard. The movement came again, a skittering rush that made my throat tighten. This time I caught a glimpse of it. Something black and low to the ground, about the size of a large dog but moving with an unnatural fluidity. It disappeared around the corner into the kitchen before I could focus on it properly. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, but my voice came out thin and uncertain. "Hear what?" Tom looked up from his new book, glasses reflecting the firelight. "That sound. From the kitchen." They exchanged glances, the kind of look that passes between friends when someone's acting strange. "Probably just the house settling," Sarah said with a shrug. "These old cabins make all kinds of noises." But I knew the difference between settling wood and something moving with purpose. I excused myself and walked toward the kitchen, my sock-clad feet silent on the cold floor. The overhead light was off, and the small windows showed only darkness pressed against the glass like a living thing. That's when I saw them. Footprints, if you could call them that. Dark smudges on the hardwood, each one about the size of my palm but oddly shaped. Not quite human, not quite animal. They looked like they'd been left by something covered in soot or ash, and they formed a trail that led directly to the wood stove in the corner. The stove was cold, stone cold. I placed my hand on the iron door and felt nothing but the chill of unused metal. We hadn't lit it once since arriving. The main fireplace in the living room provided plenty of heat, and this one was more decorative than functional. But the footprints ended right in front of it, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished into the cold iron. I called the others over, but by the time they arrived, the prints were already fading. Tom suggested they might be watermarks from a leak, though there was no sign of moisture anywhere. Marcus wondered if one of us had tracked in dirt earlier, though the prints were too fresh and too deliberately placed. "You're overthinking this, man," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Come on, let's finish opening presents." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced normalcy. We drank too much wine, played card games, and pretended everything was fine. Yet I kept glancing toward the kitchen, expecting to see that dark shape again. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the old cabin made me tense. Every whisper of wind through the pines outside sounded like movement. I lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the others breathing in the adjacent rooms. The walls were thin, and I could hear Tom's light snoring, Sarah's occasional murmur as she shifted in her sleep. Then, at exactly 3:15 a.m., I heard it, the soft whoosh of flames catching wood. I sat up in bed, heart hammering. A warm, orange glow was bleeding under my door, the kind of light that only comes from a real fire. But we'd let the main fireplace die hours ago, and I'd checked the kitchen stove before bed. It had been cold as a tomb. I crept to my door and opened it slowly. The hallway was bathed in flickering light, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of logs burning, the snap and hiss of resin igniting, the soft roar of flames consuming wood. The light was coming from the kitchen. My bare feet made no sound on the hardwood as I approached. The kitchen was warm now, genuinely warm, and the wood stove's iron door was glowing with internal fire. Through the glass panel, I could see flames dancing over what looked like perfectly arranged logs, burning with an intensity that should have been impossible given the cold metal I'd touched just hours before. But here's what made my blood freeze. There was no wood. We hadn't brought any firewood for the kitchen stove. The main fireplace had its own supply stacked beside it, but the kitchen stove had been empty since we'd arrived. I'd opened it myself during our initial tour of the cabin, peering into the cold, ash-dusted interior, where a few old char marks were the only evidence of past fires. Yet now it burned with a heat that warmed my face from 5 feet away. I stood there for nearly an hour, watching flames consume wood that shouldn't have existed. The fire burned steadily, naturally, with all the normal sounds and movements of a real blaze. But when I finally worked up the courage to approach the stove and peer through the glass, I saw something that made my vision blur. The flames were there, the heat was real, but the fire chamber was empty. No logs, no kindling, just flames dancing in vacant space, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. I stumbled back to bed, but sleep was impossible. When I returned to the kitchen the next morning, the stove was cold again. My friends were already up, making coffee and planning a hike. They complained about how chilly the cabin had gotten during the night, how the main fireplace hadn't kept the temperature up. I said nothing about the kitchen stove, but that night at 3:15 a.m., it happened again. And the next night, and the next. By the fourth morning, I was beginning to doubt my own perceptions. The lack of sleep was getting to me, leaving me jumpy and distracted. My friends noticed, of course. Sarah asked if I was feeling all right, mentioned that I seemed distant. Marcus wondered if the mountain air was agreeing with me. "You look like hell," Tom said over breakfast, not unkindly. "Are you sleeping okay?" I wanted to tell them. Wanted to grab them by the shoulders and drag them to the kitchen at 3:15 a.m., force them to see what I was seeing. But doubt had begun to creep in like cold air through a crack in the wall. What if I was having some kind of breakdown? What if the stress of the last few months, the long hours at the bank, the constant pressure, the growing sense that my life was slipping away one spreadsheet at a time, had finally caught up with me? The thought was almost comforting. Better to be losing my mind than to be experiencing something that couldn't be explained. But then I started noticing other things. The temperature in the cabin would drop suddenly for no reason, as if someone had opened a door to the outside. But all the doors and windows remained closed. The sensation of being watched became constant, a prickling awareness that made the hair on my arms stand up. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes that vanished the moment I turned my head, and the footprints kept appearing. Not every day, but often enough that I started looking for them. They'd show up in different places now, by the back door, near the window in the living room, once even in the bathroom. Always the same sooty smudges, always fading before I could show them to anyone else. My friends' concern was shifting into something else. I caught them whispering when they thought I wasn't listening, saw the way they looked at each other when I asked if they'd heard strange noises. They were starting to think I was unstable, and maybe they were right. On the sixth night, I decided to stay awake and confront whatever was happening. I positioned myself in the living room with a clear view of the kitchen, armed with a flashlight and my phone's camera. If something was going to happen at 3:15 a.m., I was going to document it. The minutes crawled by like hours. The cabin was utterly quiet except for the distant sound of wind through the trees. My friends slept on, oblivious to my vigil. I kept checking my phone, 3:10, 3:12, 3:14. At 3:15 exactly, the temperature plummeted. My breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air, and I could hear the cabin's timbers contracting with sharp cracks. The darkness in the kitchen seemed to deepen, becoming almost solid. And then, with a sound like a match being struck, the stove ignited. But this time, I saw more than just the fire. The dark shape was back, crouched in front of the stove as if feeding it fuel that didn't exist. It was definitely the size of a large dog, but its proportions were wrong. Too long in the body, limbs that bent at angles that hurt to look at, and it seemed to be made of the same sooty darkness as the footprints it left behind. I raised my phone to film it, but the screen showed only the empty kitchen. The camera couldn't see what I was seeing, just as my friends couldn't hear what I was hearing. The shape turned toward me then, and I caught a glimpse of what might have been eyes, 2 points of light in the darkness, like embers in a dying fire. Then it was gone, vanishing into the iron belly of the stove as if it had never existed. The fire burned on, warming the kitchen with heat that shouldn't have been possible. But now I knew the truth, or at least a version of it. Either I was losing my mind or something was sharing our cabin. Something that existed in the spaces between perception and reality, feeding on cold iron and empty air. I spent the rest of the night shivering in my chair, watching the impossible fire burn. When dawn finally came, the stove was cold again, and my friends woke to find me disheveled and hollow-eyed in the living room. "We need to talk," Sarah said, and I could hear the concern in her voice, the kind of careful concern reserved for someone who might be coming apart at the seams. They gathered around me like an intervention, faces filled with genuine worry. They'd been discussing me, they said. I hadn't been myself. I seemed paranoid, distracted, obsessed with sounds and shadows that no one else could perceive. "Maybe you should talk to someone when we get back," Tom suggested gently. "You've been under a lot of stress lately." Marcus nodded. "The bank's been riding you pretty hard. And with everything that happened with Rebecca..." They were right, of course. My ex-wife's remarriage had hit me harder than I'd admitted. The divorce had been finalized just 6 months ago, and seeing her happy with someone else had reopened wounds I'd thought were healing. Combined with the pressure at work, the sleepless nights, the growing sense that I was drifting through life without purpose. Maybe I was having a breakdown. Maybe the dark shape and the impossible fire were my mind's way of externalizing the chaos I felt inside. Maybe the footprints were just the product of stress and sleep deprivation, my brain creating patterns where none existed. The thought should have been terrifying, but instead, it felt like relief. Mental illness was treatable. Hallucinations could be medicated. There were explanations for what I was experiencing. Rational explanations that didn't require me to believe in things that couldn't exist. But then night fell again. And at 3:15 a.m., the stove lit with its familiar whoosh of flames. I didn't get up this time, didn't investigate or try to document what I was seeing. I just lay in bed, listening to the sound of fire consuming nothing, and wondered if the boundary between sanity and madness was as clear as I'd always believed. The cabin was warm when I woke, though it should have been cold. The kitchen stove was stone cold, though it should have been warm. And on the floor in front of it, Fading even as I watched were the familiar sooty footprints that no one else would ever see. We left the next morning, cutting our vacation short. My friends were worried about me, they said. Thought I needed to get back to familiar surroundings, maybe see a doctor. They loaded our bags into the car while I took one last look at the cabin, at the kitchen window where morning light streamed through glass that had reflected impossible flames. As we drove down the mountain, I caught one final glimpse of the cabin in the side mirror. For just a moment, I thought I saw a dark shape in the kitchen window, watching us leave. But when I turned around to look directly, there was nothing there. Just an empty cabin, waiting for the next group of friends to rent it. The next person to hear the sound of heavy wood falling, to glimpse something dark and low skittering across the hardwood. The next soul to question whether the line between reality and madness was as solid as we'd like to believe. The wood stove still sits in that kitchen, cold and empty, waiting for 3:15 a.m. to arrive again. And somewhere in the space between what we see and what we know, something continues to tend a fire that burns without fuel, casting shadows that move without light, leaving footprints that fade before they can be proven real. I'm back in the city now, back to my fluorescent lit office and my endless spreadsheets. I've made an appointment with a therapist, and I'm taking the medication she prescribed. The hallucinations have stopped, she tells me. The paranoia is fading. I'm getting better. But sometimes, in the small hours of the morning, when the building is quiet and the heating system hums its mechanical lullaby, I smell wood smoke where there should be none. And I wonder if some fires burn too deep to ever be truly extinguished. The stove is cold now, they tell me. The footprints were never real. The dark shape was just my mind playing tricks, a symptom of stress and sleep deprivation, and the ordinary breakdown that comes with being human. They're probably right. But every morning at 3:15, I wake to the scent of burning oak and the memory of impossible flames dancing in empty air. And I can't shake the feeling that somewhere in the Blue Ridge Mountains, in a cabin that sleeps peacefully through the day, something is still tending a fire that shouldn't exist. Still waiting for the next person to see what can't be seen. Still burning. Story 6. The salt air bit at my cheeks as I stepped onto the weather deck of the RMS Queen Elizabeth II, my notebook clutched against my chest like a shield. The legendary ocean liner creaked beneath my feet, her steel bones groaning with decades of Atlantic crossings. I'd come aboard during her final voyage as a passenger ship, researching maritime history for my upcoming novel, but the weight of her impending retirement pressed down on me like the gray clouds gathering overhead. The deck stretched before me, polished wood gleaming despite the overcast sky. Tourists clustered around the rails, pointing at seagulls that swooped and cried in our wake, but I found myself drawn to the quieter sections where rust stains and weathered paint told stories of storms weathered and miles conquered. The ship's constant vibration thrummed through the soles of my shoes, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to sync with my own pulse. I pulled out my phone to photograph a weathered sign mounted near the stern, its brass letters green with patina. The text swam before my eyes. Whether from the ocean spray or the fading afternoon light, I couldn't tell. I squinted, trying to make out the words, when a voice drifted over my shoulder. Lifeboat. Station. 7. The syllables came slowly, deliberately, each one enunciated with the patience of someone teaching a reluctant student. I spun around, expecting to find a crew member or perhaps another passenger helping me decipher the sign. The deck behind me was empty. A loose rope slapped against a mast somewhere in the distance, and the ever-present hum of the engines continued below, but no human figure stood within 50 feet of where I'd heard the voice. The hair on my arms prickled beneath my jacket. I looked back at the sign, and the letters now seemed crystal clear. Lifeboat Station 7. I must have been more tired than I'd realized. The constant motion of the ship, the change in time zones, the excitement of the voyage, it all contributed to a kind of sensory overload that could play tricks on the mind. I shook my head and continued my exploration, moving toward the bow where the wind whipped my hair into wild tangles. The Queen Elizabeth II cut through the Atlantic swells with the confidence of a ship that had made this journey countless times, her engines maintaining their steady rhythm despite the growing chop. Other passengers had retreated indoors as the weather worsened, leaving me nearly alone with the elements. Near the forward observation deck, I encountered another sign, this one even more weathered than the first. The metal had oxidized to an almost uniform brown, and whatever lettering had once been painted there was now little more than ghostly impressions. I leaned closer, trying to catch the faint outlines of words in the changing light, when that voice came again. Promenade, deck, port, side. This time I didn't turn around immediately. Instead, I closed my eyes and listened to the sounds around me. The splash of waves against the hull, the distant laughter from the enclosed promenade, the steady thrum of machinery. No footsteps, no breathing, no rustle of clothing that would indicate another person standing close enough to read over my shoulder. When I did finally turn, the deck remained empty. A few deck chairs had been secured with rope, and beyond them, the gray expanse of the Atlantic stretched to the horizon. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. That evening, I found myself in the ship's library, a wood-paneled sanctuary that smelled of old books and lemon oil. The librarian, a pleasant woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, helped me locate materials about the ship's history. As I read through decades of passenger manifests and crew records, I began to understand the layered stories that these walls contained. The Queen Elizabeth II had been more than just a luxury liner. During her early years, she'd served as a troop transport, carrying soldiers to and from the Falklands. She'd weathered storms that would have destroyed lesser vessels, and her passenger list read like a who's who of celebrities, politicians, and ordinary people seeking adventure on the high seas. But it was a smaller notation in a crew newsletter from 1973 that made me pause. The brief article described a literacy program that had been implemented during certain crossings, where volunteers would work with crew members who had never learned to read. The program had been the brainchild of a retired teacher named Eleanor Marsh, who'd reportedly taken passage on the QE2 multiple times specifically to help sailors improve their reading skills. According to the article, Miss Marsh had been particularly dedicated to the program, spending hours on deck with crew members during their off-duty time, patiently working through basic primers and ship terminology. The piece noted that several crew members had successfully completed their certifications thanks to her efforts. I asked the librarian if she knew anything more about the program, and her expression grew thoughtful. "Oh, I've heard stories about that," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "There was a woman who used to do that, teach reading to the crew. But something happened to her, I think. She disappeared during a crossing sometime in the mid-70s, just vanished from her cabin one night." The words sent a chill down my spine. Disappeared? That's what I heard. No one knows what happened. Some say she might have fallen overboard, but her cabin door was locked from the inside and all her belongings were still there. The crew searched the entire ship, but... She shrugged. The ocean can be a mysterious place. I spent the rest of the evening reading everything I could find about Eleanor Marsh, but the details were frustratingly sparse. She'd been a retired elementary school teacher from Connecticut, unmarried, with no close family. She'd made her final voyage on the QE2 in March of 1974, and her disappearance had merited only a brief mention in the ship's log and a small article in a Connecticut newspaper. The next morning, I woke to find the sea had calmed considerably. The ship's motion was gentler now, a slow rolling that reminded me of being rocked to sleep. I dressed quickly and headed topside, eager to explore more of the ship's history in the daylight. The forward deck was bathed in golden sunlight, and I could see other passengers beginning to emerge from their cabins, coffee cups in hand as they greeted the new day. I made my way to an area I hadn't explored yet, a section of the upper deck where service corridors connected to the main passenger areas. There, mounted on a bulkhead near a door marked "Crew Only," was another weathered sign. The letters were so faded they were nearly invisible, reduced to mere impressions in the metal. I pulled out my phone again, zooming in on the camera to see if I could make out any details when the voice came again. "Officers, mess, starboard, forward." This time I didn't jump. I'd been half expecting it. Instead, I turned around slowly, scanning the deck with deliberate care. A steward was visible far down the corridor, but he was too distant to have been the source of the voice. A few passengers moved about on the deck below, but again, none close enough to have spoken the words I'd heard. I looked back at the sign, and now the letters seemed to resolve themselves into clarity. Officers' Mess, starboard forward. The voice had been correct again. Over the next 2 days, the phenomenon continued. Every time I encountered a weathered sign, a faded plaque, or worn lettering that I couldn't quite make out, that same patient voice would spell out the words for me. The tone never varied, always gentle, always instructive, with the cadence of someone who'd spent years helping others learn to read. I began to test it deliberately. I would stand in front of illegible signs and wait, and the voice would come, clear and precise. Electrical, room, authorized, personnel, only. Emergency, equipment, do, not remove. Passenger, luggage, storage, deck, 5. Each time I would turn to find empty space behind me. Each time the hair on my arms would rise, and I would feel the peculiar sensation of being watched by someone who wasn't there. I started avoiding other passengers during these encounters, embarrassed by the thought that someone might see me apparently talking to myself or spinning around to address empty air. But the voice seemed to come only when I was alone, or nearly alone, as if it understood the need for privacy. By the 4th day, I had begun to look forward to these moments. There was something oddly comforting about the voice, despite its supernatural implications. It reminded me of my 3rd grade teacher, Mrs. Henderson, who had helped me struggle through my first chapter books with the same patient encouragement. I found myself wondering about Eleanor Marsh, the vanished teacher. Had she been the type of person who would continue her work even after death? The thought should have terrified me, but instead I felt a strange sense of gratitude. Someone, or something, was still trying to help, still trying to teach, still trying to make sure that knowledge wasn't lost to time and weather. The ship's library became my refuge during the day. I would sit for hours, reading about the QE2's history, about the lives of passengers and crew who had called her home during their crossings. The more I learned, the more I began to understand that ships like this were more than vessels. They were communities, temporary cities where people from all walks of life came together for a brief time before dispersing back into the world. Eleanor Marsh had been part of that community. She'd found her purpose in helping others, in bridging the gap between the educated and the illiterate, in ensuring that everyone aboard could read the signs that might one day save their lives. Her disappearance had been a tragedy, but perhaps her dedication had been so complete that it had somehow transcended physical death. On the 5th night, I dreamed I was standing on deck during a storm. The wind howled around me, and rain lashed the ship's superstructure. I was trying to read a sign that kept changing, its letters rearranging themselves faster than I could follow. Then I heard the voice, clearer than ever before, spelling out words not on any sign. Help them learn. Help them survive. I woke with a start, my heart racing. The ship was rolling more heavily now, and I could hear the whistle of wind around the windows. We were encountering rougher weather, but nothing like the storm in my dream. I dressed and made my way to the observation deck, driven by a compulsion I couldn't quite name. The night was wild but not dangerous, with whitecaps visible in the moonlight and the ship riding the swells with practiced ease. I stood at the rail, watching the water, when I heard the voice again. But this time, it wasn't reading a sign. Instead, it was speaking directly to me. The words carried on the wind, like a message from the depths of the ocean itself. You understand. Now. I spun around, and for just a moment I could have sworn I saw a figure standing near the bulkhead. A woman in a simple dress, her hair pulled back, her face kind but indistinct. She held what looked like a primer in her hands, the kind used to teach basic reading skills. But when I blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only the empty deck and the sound of waves against the hull. The next morning brought calmer seas and our approach to Southampton. I packed my belongings slowly, reluctant to leave the ship that had become home to such an extraordinary experience. I had enough material for my novel, but more than that, I had a story that would stay with me for the rest of my life. As the Queen Elizabeth II entered port, I made one final tour of the decks. Near the stern, I found a sign I hadn't noticed before, or perhaps it had been too weathered to read during my earlier visits. Now, in the clear morning light, I could make out most of the letters. In memory of those lost at sea. I stood there for a long time, thinking about Eleanor Marsh and the countless others who had found their final rest in the Atlantic's depths. The ocean had taken them, but their stories lived on in the steel and wood of the ships they had loved, in the memories of those who had known them, and sometimes, perhaps, in the patient voices that continued to teach long after the teachers themselves had disappeared. As I gathered my things and prepared to disembark, I heard the voice one last time, so soft I might have imagined it. Remember. I turned to look back at the empty deck, then down at my notebook filled with observations and research. I would remember, I would write their stories, and perhaps in doing so, I would help ensure that the lessons they had tried to teach would not be lost to time and tide. The gangplank lowered, and passengers began to file off the ship. I joined the queue, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I reached the pier and turned back for one last look at the QE2, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing at the rail of the upper deck waving goodbye. But when I looked again, there was nothing there but the ship herself, magnificent and eternal, ready to carry her next load of passengers across the vast Atlantic. And somewhere in her steel heart, the voices of the past continued to whisper their lessons to those who knew how to listen. Author's note. I returned to my hotel room that night and began writing this account. As I typed, I found myself occasionally pausing to sound out words I was having trouble spelling, and each time, I could have sworn I heard that patient voice helping me along. But perhaps that was just my imagination. Or perhaps some teachers never truly stop teaching, no matter where their final classroom might be. Story 7. The first time Marcus showed up at midnight grind, I should have trusted my gut. Something about the way he lingered at the edge of my peripheral vision, always just outside the warm cone of light from the espresso machine, made my skin crawl. But Austin draws all kinds, and working the night shift at a 24-hour coffee shop means you learn to tolerate the odd ones. The insomniacs, the artists, the people who live in the spaces between normal hours. They're your bread and butter. Marcus wasn't like the others, though. He had this way of ordering that made my teeth ache. Not what he ordered. Always the same double-shot Americano, no cream, no sugar. But how he said it. His voice had this quality, like he was speaking through water, each word deliberate and somehow wrong. And his eyes never left my face, not even when I turned away to work the machine. The night he started talking about his collection, I was wiping down the counter for the third time in an hour. October in Austin still holds on to summer's humid grip, but the cafe felt cold that night, the AC struggling against something that wasn't quite temperature. "You have interesting features," he said, and I nearly dropped the rag. His voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, though he stood right there at the counter. Strong jawline, expressive eyes. You'd make a beautiful addition. I laughed it off. What else do you do? But the way he said addition lingered in my mind long after he'd paid and drifted back to his corner table. He always sat in the same spot, a small round table near the emergency exit, where the overhead light flickered just enough to cast shifting shadows across his face. The weeks that followed, Marcus became a fixture. He'd arrive exactly at 9:30 p.m., order his Americano, and settle into his corner. Sometimes he'd bring a book, always something thick and leather-bound that looked older than it should. Other times he'd just sit there, watching. Not reading, not using his phone, just watching. The other late-night regulars gave him a wide berth, as if they sensed something I was still trying to name. He started bringing photos on a Thursday. Polaroids, he said, of his collection. The first one showed a wall lined with theatrical masks, comedy, tragedy, elaborate Venetian pieces with feathers and jewels. They were beautiful, I had to admit, but something about seeing them arranged in neat rows made my stomach turn, like specimens in a case. Each one has its own story, Marcus explained, his finger tracing the edge of the photo. This one belonged to a performer in New Orleans. This one came from a small theater in Prague, and this one... He pointed to a simple white mask, plain except for the subtle curve of its smile. This one I made myself. The way he said it made me step back from the counter. His eyes had taken on a distant quality, like he was seeing something I couldn't. Something that wasn't quite there. That's great, man, I managed. Sounds like quite a hobby. He smiled then, and I wished he hadn't. There was something wrong with his teeth, though I couldn't put my finger on what. Too many of them, maybe. Or maybe they were too sharp. Or maybe I was just tired, pulling double shifts to cover for Sarah, who'd called in sick 3 days running. The conversation should have ended there. Should have been just another weird interaction in a long string of weird interactions that come with the territory. But Marcus didn't seem to understand social cues. He kept talking, his voice taking on that underwater quality again. I'm always looking for new pieces, he said. Sometimes I commission them. Sometimes I find them in antique shops. But the best ones... He paused, and in that pause, the cafe's fluorescent lights seemed to dim. The best ones choose me. I busied myself with the espresso machine, letting the familiar hiss of steam fill the silence. When I looked up, Marcus was gone. His cup sat empty on the counter, but I hadn't heard him leave. Hadn't heard the door chime or his footsteps on the tile floor. The next morning, Sarah finally returned, looking pale and shaken. She claimed she'd been sick, but there was something in her eyes that suggested otherwise. Something that looked like fear. Did anything weird happen while I was out? She asked, not meeting my gaze. I thought about Marcus, about his photos and his talk of collections, about the way he'd disappeared without a sound. Nothing unusual, I lied. But that night, things changed. I was alone again. Sarah had requested to be moved to the day shift, and our manager was still looking for a replacement. The cafe felt different after 10 p.m., as if the familiar space had been replaced by something that only looked the same. The shadows seemed deeper, the corners more pronounced. The fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency that made my molars ache. Marcus didn't show up at 9:30. For the first time in weeks, his corner table remained empty. I told myself I was relieved, but part of me kept glancing at the door, waiting for his familiar silhouette to appear against the glass. At 10:22, I was cleaning the espresso machine when I heard it. A soft scratching sound, like fingernails on wood. It was coming from the back of the cafe, near the emergency exit. I grabbed a flashlight from behind the counter and made my way through the maze of tables and chairs. The scratching stopped as I approached. The emergency exit looked normal. Heavy metal door, push bar, the usual warning signs. But something was different. Something that made me pause with my hand on the flashlight switch. Hanging from the door handle was a mask. It was beautiful and terrible, a theatrical piece that seemed to shift and change in the flashlight's beam. The face was painted white with intricate gold scrollwork around the eyes and mouth. Feathers sprouted from the temples, deep blue and black, and tiny bells hung from the chin. It looked expensive, professional, like something you'd see in a high-end costume shop or a museum. Attached to the mask was a small card, the kind you'd find in a flower arrangement. The writing was in an elegant script, the ink still wet enough to glisten under the fluorescent lights. The appetizer course is served. The main dish remains undercooked. My hands shook as I read the words. The mask swayed gently on its string, though I couldn't feel any breeze. The feathers rustled with a sound like whispered secrets. I should have called the police, should have called my manager, should have done anything except what I actually did, which was carefully untie the mask and carry it back to the counter. Up close, it was even more beautiful, the craftsmanship exquisite. The inside was lined with silk, and there was a faint scent of something I couldn't identify. Something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water. The security camera had been recording all night. I pulled up the footage on the back office computer, scrolling through the timestamp until I found 10:22. The camera had a clear view of the emergency exit, but the image showed nothing. One frame. The door was empty. The next, the mask was already hanging there, swaying gently as if it had been there all along. I rewound the footage, played it again in slow motion. Same result. The mask simply appeared, as if it had been digitally inserted into the frame. But that was impossible. The camera was analog, connected to an old DVR system that hadn't been updated in years. There was no way to manipulate the footage. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, but the image never changed. The mask appeared at exactly 10:22, without explanation, without logic, without any sign of the person who had placed it there. The next night, I arrived early, determined to solve the mystery. I checked every door, every window, every possible entry point. The cafe was secure, empty except for me, and the weight of my own paranoia. I positioned myself at the counter with a clear view of the emergency exit and waited. Marcus didn't come. The usual late-night crowd was thin. Just Mrs. Chen, who always ordered chamomile tea and did crossword puzzles until midnight, and a young couple who whispered to each other in the corner booth. Normal people living normal lives in a normal coffee shop. At 10:21, I was watching the emergency exit so intently that my eyes watered. The door remained empty, unchanged. I glanced at the clock. 10:21:58, 10:21:59, 10:22. The mask was there. I blinked, certain I was seeing things. But no, hanging from the door handle was a new mask, different from the first. This one was silver, with a long curved nose and hollow eye sockets that seemed to pull light into them. It was beautiful and horrible, like something from a fever dream. I rushed to the door, but there was no one there. No sound, no movement, no sign of how the mask had appeared. Just the gentle swaying motion and another card, this one written in the same elegant script. The second course arrives. The main dish grows restless. This time I didn't hesitate. I called the police. Officer Martinez was patient but skeptical. She examined the mask, dusted for fingerprints, reviewed the security footage. The results were the same. No prints, no evidence of tampering, no explanation for how the mask had appeared. "Look," she said, handing me her card. "This is probably just someone playing a prank. Maybe a disgruntled customer. Maybe someone who knows about the security system. But if it happens again, call us immediately." After she left, I sat alone in the cafe, staring at the emergency exit. The mask was gone. Evidence, Officer Martinez had said. But I could still see it in my mind's eye, swaying in the fluorescent light. The way it had seemed to watch me, even with those hollow eye sockets. The third night, I wasn't alone. Jake, the new hire, had finally started, and I was grateful for the company. He was young, maybe 22, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having seen anything truly strange. "So what's the deal with the mask thing?" he asked, wiping down tables with the kind of enthusiasm that would fade after a few weeks. The day shift was talking about it. I explained what I could, leaving out the parts that made me sound crazy. Jake listened with the polite attention of someone who thinks he's hearing an urban legend. "Probably just some art student," he said. "You know how weird they get in this neighborhood." At 10:22, we were both watching the emergency exit. Jake was making jokes about ghost stories and haunted coffee shops, but his laughter died when the mask appeared. This one was red leather, with brass studs, and a cruel smile etched into the surface. It looked like something from a medieval torture chamber. "What the hell?" Jake whispered, and I was grateful that someone else had seen it, that I wasn't losing my mind. The card read, "The third course is presented. The main dish begins to simmer." Jake wanted to stay and watch the cameras, to figure out how it was happening. But I sent him home early, claiming I needed to close alone. The truth was, I was scared. Not just of the masks, but of what they might mean. Of the growing certainty that Marcus was behind this, even though I had no proof. The fourth night I almost didn't go to work, I sat in my car in the parking lot, staring at the cafe's windows, trying to convince myself that this was all some elaborate prank, that there was a logical explanation for everything. But the rent was due, and I needed the job. So I unlocked the door and stepped into the fluorescent-lit space that no longer felt like sanctuary. The mask that appeared at 10:22 was the most beautiful yet, a porcelain face with roses painted on the cheeks and real diamonds set into the eye sockets. It was worth more than I made in a month, maybe more than I made in a year. The fourth course is served. The main dish is almost ready. I didn't call the police this time. What was the point? They'd ask the same questions, find the same lack of evidence, file the same report that would disappear into some bureaucratic filing system. Instead, I sat at Marcus's usual table and waited. He appeared at 11:30, materializing from the shadows near the restroom as if he'd been there all along. His smile was different now, wider, more confident, like a man who knew he was winning a game I didn't understand. "You've been collecting my gifts," he said, settling into his chair. "I hope you appreciate the craftsmanship." "What do you want?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Want?" Marcus tilted his head, and in the fluorescent light, his face seemed to shift and change. "I want what I've always wanted, to complete my collection." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a Polaroid photo. This one showed a wall of masks, but they were different from the ones he'd shown me before. These looked newer, more lifelike, and in the center of the arrangement was an empty space, just the right size for a human face. "You see," Marcus continued, "I don't collect masks at all. I collect expressions, moments of perfect terror crystallized forever. And you, my dear barista, have been marinating in fear for days now. You're almost ready." I stood up so fast that my chair fell backward. The sound echoed through the empty cafe like a gunshot. "You're insane," I said, backing toward the counter. Marcus laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. Insane? Perhaps, but also very, very patient. "Do you know how long it takes to properly prepare a face? To season it with just the right amount of dread?" I reached for my phone, but Marcus was faster. He moved like liquid shadow, flowing around the table and across the space between us. His hand closed over mine, and his skin was cold as marble. "The fifth course will be served tomorrow," he whispered, his breath smelling of old roses and something else, something rotting. And then finally the main dish. The next morning I called in sick, and the morning after that. I told myself I was being smart, that I was avoiding whatever game Marcus was playing. But deep down, I knew it was just postponing the inevitable. On the third morning, my manager called. Jake hadn't shown up for his shift, and they needed me to cover. The cafe was short-staffed, and I was the only one who knew how to work the espresso machine. I wanted to refuse, to make up some excuse about being sick or having a family emergency, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself agreeing, promising to be there by 9 p.m. The cafe felt different when I unlocked the door. The shadows seemed deeper, the fluorescent lights dimmer, and there, hanging from the emergency exit, was the fifth mask. This one was simple, plain white ceramic with no decoration except for a small crack running from the left temple to the corner of the mouth. It looked fragile, like something that might shatter at a touch. The card read, "The fifth course is complete. The main dish is ready to serve." I didn't take the mask down. I left it hanging there, swaying in the artificial breeze from the air conditioning, and went about my opening routine. I brewed coffee, arranged pastries, tried to pretend that everything was normal. Marcus arrived at 9:30, just like always. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, barely visible in the reflected light from the windows, were other figures. People I recognized, customers who had stopped coming, employees who had quit without notice, faces from the neighborhood who had simply disappeared. They all wore masks. "Time to close," Marcus said, though it was only 9:45. "The kitchen is ready." I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything except what I actually did. But my body wasn't listening to my mind anymore. I moved like a puppet on strings, turning the sign to closed, dimming the lights, following Marcus toward the emergency exit. "You've been such a good sport," he said, reaching for the white mask. "Most people struggle so much more." As his fingers touched the ceramic, I saw the truth. The masks weren't decorations or artwork. They were people, customers, employees, everyone who had come too close to Marcus's collection. Their faces, their expressions, their final moments of terror preserved forever in plaster and porcelain and leather. The white mask turned to look at me, and I saw my own eyes staring back. "Welcome to the collection," Marcus said, and his voice was the sound of breaking glass and dying flowers. "You're going to make a beautiful addition." The last thing I remember is the feel of cool ceramic against my skin, the sweet smell of roses, and the sound of my own voice joining the whispered chorus of all the others who had come before. Now I hang in Marcus's collection, watching through hollow eye sockets as he prepares for the next course, the next face, the next beautiful addition to his ever-growing gallery of terror. Sometimes late at night I can still feel the weight of the espresso machine's steam wand in my hand, can still hear the familiar hiss of milk being frothed. But those sensations fade quickly, replaced by the eternal present of the collection room. And I wait, like all the others, for the next midnight shift to begin. The masks appear at 10:22 every night, just as they always have. But now I know the truth. They're not being placed there by some mysterious figure. They're manifesting themselves, drawn by the weight of accumulated fear and the promise of a new addition to the collection. The cafe is still open, still serving coffee to the night shift workers and insomniacs of Austin. There's a new barista now, a young woman with bright eyes and steady hands. She doesn't know about Marcus yet, doesn't understand the significance of the corner table or the emergency exit, but she will. They always do. And when she does, when the fear has marinated long enough and the terror has reached its perfect peak, she'll join us here in the collection. Another beautiful face, another perfect expression, another story that ends exactly where it began, in the space between the real and the imagined, where masks become faces and faces become masks, and the only constant is the ticking of the clock toward 10:22. The main dish is always ready. The main dish is never served. The main dish is eternal. Story 8. The first thing you notice about old buildings in Baltimore is how they seem to lean inward, as if the weight of decades has compressed them into something smaller, more secretive. My office sat in one such building on Charles Street, wedged between a used bookstore and a dry cleaner that always smelled faintly of chemicals. The building had been many things over the years: a boarding house, a millinery shop, apartments. But when I bought it in 2018, all I saw was potential. The external fire escape had been bothering me for months. Built sometime in the 50s, it was a rickety metal affair that groaned under the weight of a sparrow. My insurance customers would glance at it nervously when they climbed to my second-floor office, and I'd caught myself doing the same. So when spring arrived and the city sent its annual fire safety notice, I decided it was time for a proper wooden staircase. I hired Jimmy Kowalski, a stonemason who'd been recommended by 3 different contractors. He was a compact man in his 60s, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same stone he worked. We met on a Tuesday morning in March, the kind of day when Baltimore's sky hangs low and gray, pressing down on the city like a lid on a pot. Jimmy examined the existing structure with the methodical attention of someone who understood how buildings could betray you. He ran his fingers along the brick wall, tapped the mortar joints, and peered into the narrow alley that separated my building from the next. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience. "This'll be straightforward enough," he said, pulling out a worn notebook. "But I'll need to anchor into the original structure. These old buildings, they've got stories buried in their bones." I thought it was an odd way to phrase it, but Jimmy struck me as the kind of man who spoke in metaphors. We shook hands, agreed on a price, and he promised to start the following Monday. The work began routinely enough. Jimmy arrived each morning at 7 sharp, his truck loaded with treated lumber and the kind of tools that suggested serious craftsmanship. He was methodical, measuring twice and cutting once, the way old-school tradesmen approach their work. I'd watch him from my office window during breaks, noting how he seemed to study the building as much as he worked on it. It was on Thursday that things began to shift. I was reviewing a liability policy when I heard voices outside. Nothing unusual. Jimmy occasionally worked with a helper, and the alley carried sound in strange ways. But something about the cadence caught my attention. One voice was clearly Jimmy's, rough and practical. The other was softer, almost whispered, though I couldn't make out the words. Curious, I moved to the window and peered down. Jimmy stood on the half-completed staircase, his back to me, apparently engaged in conversation, but I could see no one else in the alley. The narrow space was empty, except for the usual urban debris. A few discarded newspapers, a broken umbrella, the persistent smell of the dry cleaner's chemicals. Jimmy nodded several times, as if receiving instructions, then adjusted the position of a support beam he'd been installing. The movement seemed deliberate, purposeful, as if he were following specific guidance. I watched for another minute, but the second voice had fallen silent. When I mentioned it to Jimmy during his lunch break, he looked up from his sandwich with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Just talking through the work," he said after a moment. "Sometimes it helps to say things out loud, you know? Make sure I'm getting it right." I accepted this explanation, though something in his tone suggested there was more to it. Jimmy was not the kind of man who needed to talk himself through simple carpentry. The next day, I made a point of listening more carefully. The conversation resumed around 10 in the morning, Jimmy's voice mixing with that softer, nearly inaudible whisper. This time I caught fragments. "The beam goes there, not there." "Right, I see what you mean about the angle. Been doing this work longer than I've been alive." That last comment stopped me cold. Jimmy had been a craftsman for over 40 years, had learned from his father and grandfather before him. Who could have been doing this work longer than he'd been alive? I found myself making excuses to check the window throughout the day. Each time I saw Jimmy working with the focused intensity of someone following detailed instructions, occasionally pausing to nod or adjust his approach. But I never saw anyone else in the alley. By Monday of the second week, the staircase was nearly complete. Jimmy had crafted something beautiful, solid oak steps with hand-turned balusters, each piece fitted with the precision of a master carpenter. But I'd noticed other changes too. Jimmy seemed tired, distracted, glancing frequently at spaces where I saw nothing. It was Tuesday afternoon when I decided to investigate more directly. I'd been hearing the conversations for over a week, and my curiosity had curdled into something more unsettling. There was an intimacy to the exchanges that bothered me, as if Jimmy were collaborating with someone who knew the building better than he did. I made my way down to the alley, ostensibly to examine the progress. Jimmy was on the staircase, about halfway up, securing the final baluster. He was speaking in low tones, his voice carrying that deferential quality I'd noticed before. "I understand," he was saying. "The support needs to go exactly there. You've seen what happens when the weight isn't distributed properly." I cleared my throat, and Jimmy looked down at me with a startled expression. "How's it coming along?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Good, good," Jimmy replied, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. "Should be finished by Thursday." I looked around the alley, noting once again that we were alone. "I couldn't help but notice you've been talking through the work a lot. Making sure everything's right?" Jimmy's hands stilled on the baluster. For a moment, his eyes seemed to focus on something just past my shoulder, and I felt an inexplicable urge to turn around. But there was nothing there, just the narrow alley and the blank wall of the neighboring building. "Yeah," Jimmy said finally. "This old lady's been helping me out. Knows a lot about the building, about how things used to be constructed. She's been real helpful." An old lady. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Oh? I haven't seen anyone else around." Jimmy looked at me strangely. "She's right there," he said, pointing to a spot on the staircase about 3 steps below where he stood. Been there most of the morning. I followed his gaze and saw nothing but empty air and the weathered wood of the new steps. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to examine. "Well," I said, backing toward the building's entrance, "I'll let you get back to work." That evening, I found myself researching the building's history. The deed records downtown were a maze of transfers and renovations, but I eventually traced the property back to the 1920s. What I found made my hands shake as I read. From 1925 to 1963, the building had housed the Sisters of Sacred Heart Rest Home, a facility for elderly women operated by an order of Catholic nuns. The architectural plans from that era showed something that made my blood run cold. Where Jimmy's staircase now stood, there had once been an external elevator, a cage-like contraption that had carried the elderly residents between floors. According to a newspaper clipping from 1963, the elevator had been the site of a tragic accident. Sister Margaret Catherine, the home's head administrator, had been using the elevator when the cable snapped. The article described her as a woman of diminutive stature who always wore her traditional white coif, and noted that her body was found in the elevator cage at the bottom of the shaft. The building had been abandoned after that, eventually converted to apartments and then commercial space. The elevator shaft had been filled in, the machinery removed, and the entire structure forgotten. Until now. I barely slept that night, my mind churning with questions I didn't want to answer. The next morning I arrived at the office early, hoping to catch Jimmy before he started work. But when I looked out the window, he was already on the staircase, and he was not alone. For just a moment, no more than a heartbeat, I saw her. A small figure in dark clothing, her hair covered by what looked like a white nun's coif. She stood on the steps beside Jimmy, her hand resting on the banister, and she was speaking in that soft, authoritative voice I'd been hearing all week. I blinked, and she was gone. But Jimmy remained, nodding and adjusting his work, following instructions from someone who had died 60 years ago in the exact spot where he now stood. I should have confronted him, should have demanded explanations or called someone, a doctor, a priest, anyone who might understand what was happening. Instead, I found myself watching from the window, fascinated and terrified in equal measure. The conversations continued throughout the day, Jimmy's voice mixing with that whispered guidance. I began to pick up more details, fragments that painted a picture of someone who had spent decades overseeing the building's maintenance, someone who understood its quirks and weaknesses better than any living person could. "The third step always creaked," Jimmy murmured at one point. "You reinforced it from underneath, didn't you?" A pause, then. "That's right. The weight distribution was never quite right. Good thing you remembered." By Thursday, the staircase was complete. Jimmy had crafted something that seemed to belong to the building in a way that went beyond mere construction. The stairs felt like they had always been there, as if the building had been waiting 60 years for someone to understand how they should be built. I paid Jimmy, thanked him for his work, and watched him load his truck. As he prepared to leave, he paused and looked back at the staircase. "You know," he said, "I've been doing this work for 40 years, and I've never had a project go so smoothly. It's like the building was telling me exactly what it needed." After he left, I stood in the alley, examining the craftsmanship. The stairs were perfect, each step precisely positioned, each joint seamless. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite name. The staircase felt occupied, as if it retained the memory of everyone who had ever used it. I climbed to the second floor slowly, my hand trailing along the smooth banister. The wood was warm under my fingers, and I could swear I felt a subtle vibration, as if someone else were climbing just behind me. I paused on the landing, listening to the settling sounds of the old building, and wondered if I was losing my mind. Over the following weeks, I found myself using the stairs more frequently than necessary. There was something compelling about them, a sense that they were not quite finished, not quite settled. I would climb them in the morning, and the wood would creak in a rhythm that seemed almost like conversation. I would descend them in the evening, and the shadows would shift in ways that suggested movement, just beyond my peripheral vision. And sometimes, late at night when the building was quiet, I would hear footsteps on the staircase. Soft, measured steps that climbed from the alley to the second floor, paused at the landing, then continued upward to floors that no longer existed. I began to research Sister Margaret Catherine, diving deeper into the records of the Sacred Heart Rest Home. What I found was the portrait of a woman who had dedicated her life to caring for others, who had supervised the building's maintenance with the same devotion she showed her residents. The newspaper accounts described her as someone who knew every corner of the building, who could predict when repairs would be needed months before problems became apparent. She had died doing what she had always done, moving between floors, checking on those in her care, ensuring that everything in the building was exactly as it should be. The more I learned, the more the conversations I'd overheard began to make sense. Jimmy hadn't been talking to himself or following some mysterious intuition. He had been receiving guidance from someone who understood the building better than anyone living could, someone who had been waiting 60 years for the right person to come along and complete the work she had started. I should have been terrified, should have moved my office, sold the building, done anything to escape the implications of what I'd witnessed. But instead, I found myself oddly comforted by the thought of Sister Margaret Catherine's presence. The building felt safer somehow, as if it were being watched over by someone who genuinely cared about its welfare. The staircase Jimmy had built was more than just a fire escape. It was a bridge between past and present, a place where the building's history continued to unfold. And every time I climbed those stairs, feeling that subtle vibration beneath my feet, I wondered if I was walking in the footsteps of someone who had never really left. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I would stand at my office window and look down at the staircase. The shadows would shift and dance, and I would catch glimpses of a small figure in dark clothing, her white coif bright against the morning darkness. She would move between the steps with the familiarity of someone who had walked this path countless times before, checking the joints, testing the stability, ensuring that everything was as it should be. And I would think about the nature of care, about the bonds that tie us to the places we love, and wonder if death is really the end of our responsibilities or just another way of fulfilling them. The staircase stands there still, solid and beautiful, a testament to the collaboration between a skilled craftsman and a guardian spirit who refused to let her watch end. Whether what I witnessed was real or the product of an overactive imagination, I cannot say. But I know that every time I climb those stairs, I am not alone. And somehow, that no longer frightens me. It comforts me. Story 9. The house exhaled with me that first night, its ancient wooden bones settling into familiar grooves as I arranged my laptop on the kitchen table. Grandma's place in Vermont had been vacant for 3 months since the funeral, and I'd finally worked up the courage to spend a week here, hoping the isolation might help me break through the creative block that had been strangling my screenwriting career. I'd forgotten how the old Victorian breathed. Every temperature shift sent whispers through its corridors. Every wind gust outside triggered a symphony of creaks and sighs from within. The real estate agent had warned me about the character of the house, but I'd grown up visiting during summers, and the familiar sounds should have been comforting. They weren't. Something felt different now, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Maybe it was the way shadows seemed to pool in corners where I didn't remember them gathering before, or how the silence between the house's breathing felt heavier, more expectant. I told myself it was grief playing tricks on my perception, that being alone in a place so intrinsically connected to Grandma's memory would naturally feel unsettling. The second-floor guest room, where I'd always slept during childhood visits, looked exactly as I remembered. The same faded floral wallpaper, the same antique brass bed frame, the same milk glass lamp on the nightstand. But when I flicked the lamp switch that first evening, the bulb flickered 3 times before steadying, casting erratic shadows across the walls. I made a mental note to check the wiring in the morning. Sleep came surprisingly easy that night, aided by the wine I'd brought from the city and the exhaustion of the drive. I drifted off to the familiar lullaby of the house settling, my laptop charging on the dresser across the room, its power light blinking steadily in the darkness. The breath across my neck woke me, not a dream fragment or the residual sensation of a pillow shifting, a deliberate warm exhalation that raised every hair on my arms. My eyes snapped open, and I found myself staring at the opposite wall, my back to the rest of the room. The breath had come from directly behind me, close enough that I'd felt the moisture against my skin. I rolled over fast, my heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing. The room was empty, filled with the same shadows and ambient light filtering through the curtains. But the bedside lamp was swaying slightly, its chain making tiny metallic sounds as it moved. I watched it for a full minute, trying to convince myself that my sudden movement had caused the disturbance, that old houses and old furniture were prone to such quirks. The lamp stopped swaying. I checked the time, 2:41 a.m. For the rest of the night I lay rigid, hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the house's breathing. When dawn finally crept through the windows, I felt more exhausted than when I'd gone to bed. I made coffee and tried to write, but my mind kept circling back to that breath, that inexplicable warmth against my neck. The rational part of my brain offered logical explanations, temperature differentials in old houses, the heating system cycling on, even the possibility of a minor sleep disorder. Writers were prone to vivid dreams after all. Stress and grief could manifest in strange ways, but I knew what I'd felt. The second night, I left the lamp on. This time, I lay awake deliberately, listening to the house's nocturnal symphony. The heating system cycled off around midnight, and gradually, the background noises diminished until I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence. I'd positioned myself on my side, facing the room, determined to catch whatever might be causing the disturbances. At 2:41 a.m., the mattress depressed beside me, not a gradual sinking, but a sudden, decisive weight, as if someone had sat down on the edge of the bed. The old springs groaned in protest, and I felt the unmistakable shift of the entire mattress tilting toward the new weight. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the empty space where the impression was forming. I couldn't move. Terror had locked my muscles, turned my limbs to stone. I watched the indentation deepen, watched the bedspread wrinkle, and conform to an invisible shape. The weight remained for perhaps 10 seconds, then lifted as suddenly as it had appeared. The mattress rebounded, the springs settling back into place with a series of tiny metallic pings. I didn't sleep again until daylight. The third day, I began searching the house systematically. I told myself I was looking for practical explanations. Loose floorboards that might cause vibrations, air vents that could create drafts, anything that might account for the phenomena. But deep down, I was searching for something else, some acknowledgement that I wasn't losing my mind. I found it in the basement, in a water-stained cardboard box labeled "Personal Items" in Grandma's careful script. The box contained her personal effects from the last few years of her life: reading glasses, prescription bottles, a few books, and 3 cloth-bound journals. The journals were filled with her familiar handwriting, chronicling everything from garden observations to grocery lists to doctor appointments. But scattered throughout the mundane entries were others that made my skin crawl. March 15th. He was here again last night, the same time, always the same time. I kept the light on, but it doesn't matter anymore. He doesn't like the light, but he comes anyway. March 22nd. Dr. Morrison says it's just anxiety, but I know better. The guest without a face has been coming for weeks now. He sits beside me and I can feel his weight, but when I turn to look, there's nothing there. Just the impression in the mattress and the sound of breathing. April 3rd. I've started sleeping downstairs. Maybe he won't follow me there. Maybe he's tied to that room, to that bed. But I can hear him walking upstairs at night, back and forth, looking for me. April 18th. It doesn't matter where I sleep. He finds me. Always at 2:41. I've checked the clocks. They're all correct. He's punctual, I'll give him that. Sometimes I wonder if he's trying to tell me something, but faces are necessary for communication, and he has none. May 2nd. I told Margaret about the visitor, but she thinks I'm getting senile. Maybe I am. Maybe this is how it starts, with guests who don't exist and conversations with empty rooms. But his breathing is so real, so warm against my neck. If I'm going crazy, at least I'm not alone. May 20th. I've stopped fighting it. When he comes, I just lie still and let him sit. Sometimes I think he's lonely too. Sometimes I think that's why he hates the light. It reveals the truth of his absence. In the dark, he can pretend to be real. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before her death. June 4th. I understand now. He's not trying to harm me. He's trying to tell me something important. About the house, about the room, about what happens when you turn off the light. I think he's been waiting a long time for someone to listen. I think he's been waiting for someone to understand that some guests never leave. They just learn to be quiet. I closed the journal with shaking hands. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was confirmation of dementia, that Grandma's final months had been clouded by illness and confusion. But the descriptions were too specific, too precisely aligned with my own experiences. The timing, the sensations, the breathing. She'd documented everything I was experiencing. That night I made a decision. I would stay awake and confront whatever was happening. I would demand answers from the darkness, from the weight on the mattress, from the faceless guest who had tormented my grandmother's final months. I prepared methodically. I charged my phone, set up my laptop to record, positioned a digital camera on the dresser. If something was truly happening, I would document it. If I was losing my mind, at least I'd have evidence of my deterioration. At 2:41 a.m., I was ready. The room was dark except for the glow from my devices. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, my entire body tense with anticipation. The house held its breath around me, as if it too were waiting. Then I felt it, not the breath this time, but a presence. A subtle shift in the air pressure, a thickness that hadn't been there moments before. The temperature dropped several degrees, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The mattress began to sink beside me. But this time, I didn't freeze. I turned my head slowly, deliberately, to face the depression forming in the bed. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. Not a face, but the absence of one. A vague suggestion of human form, outlined in shadow and negative space. Where features should have been, there was only a void that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The shape was sitting upright beside me, its head turned in my direction, and though it had no eyes, I could feel its attention focused on me with laser intensity. We regarded each other in perfect silence. The recording devices showed no reaction, no acknowledgement of what I was seeing. The weight on the mattress was real. I could feel it, see the springs compressed beneath it, but the cameras registered nothing. Then, impossibly, it spoke. Not with words, but with a voice that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my mind. The communication was wordless but perfectly clear. Thank you for not turning on the light. The presence began to fade, the depression in the mattress slowly releasing, the temperature gradually returning to normal. But before it disappeared entirely, I understood something that chilled me more than its appearance. It wasn't leaving. It was simply becoming invisible again, retreating to whatever space it occupied when the lights were on. I've been in the house for 2 weeks now, and I haven't left. My screenwriting deadline passed days ago, but I can't bring myself to abandon this place. Each night I lie in darkness and wait for 2:41 a.m. Each night, the faceless guest sits beside me, and we share our wordless communion. I found more journals yesterday, hidden in the attic. Dozens of them, dating back over a century. Different handwriting, different decades, but the same story repeated over and over. The guest without a face, the breathing on the pillow, the weight on the mattress. Every owner of this house has eventually learned to accommodate their permanent visitor. The journals reveal a pattern. Those who fought the presence, who insisted on keeping lights on, who tried to banish it through will or prayer or renovation, eventually fled the house. But those who accepted it, who learned to coexist with their faceless roommate, found a strange kind of peace. I think I understand now why Grandma spent her final months here willingly, why she stopped fighting and started listening. The guest isn't malevolent, it's simply insistent. It wants acknowledgement. It wants to be remembered, to be accepted as part of the house's legacy. Tonight, I'll turn off the recording devices. I'll stop trying to capture evidence of something that exists beyond the reach of cameras and microphones. I'll lie in darkness and wait for 2:41 a.m., and when the mattress sinks beside me, I'll whisper, "Good evening," into the void. Because I'm beginning to understand that some guests never leave. They simply learn to be quiet during daylight hours, waiting patiently for the darkness to give them substance again. And perhaps, in a house this old, a house that has witnessed over a century of human drama, that's exactly as it should be. The real question isn't whether the faceless guest is real or imaginary. The real question is whether that distinction matters anymore. In the space between sleep and waking, between sanity and madness, between the living and whatever lies beyond, perhaps there's room for all kinds of guests. I just hope I'm brave enough to be a good host. Story 10. The recording needle jumped at 3:47 a.m., and I knew they were coming again. I'd been hunched over my mixing board for 6 hours straight, crafting the perfect footstep sequence for an indie horror film. Ironically appropriate, given what was about to happen. My home studio occupied the converted bedroom of my Indianapolis rental, a cramped space where creativity flourished despite the peeling wallpaper and the persistent smell of old cigarettes that no amount of air freshener could mask. The first knock came exactly as I pressed record on the Foley track. Thud, then another. Thud. A measured, deliberate rhythm that seemed to emanate from the sealed plaster ceiling directly above my head. 6 knocks total, each one matching the exact tempo of the metronome I'd switched off 20 minutes earlier. I'd been working as a sound technician for 8 years, and I knew every creak, groan, and settling sound this old house made. This wasn't settling. This was something else entirely. The ceiling above me showed no signs of disturbance, just the same yellowed plaster that had been sealed during the renovation 3 years ago. No access panel, no attic ladder, no way up there without tearing through the drywall. The landlord had been adamant about that when I'd moved in. The space above was dead air, filled with old insulation and structural beams that made it impossible to navigate. I rewound the tape and played it back. The footsteps I'd recorded were there, crisp and clean, but underneath them, barely audible unless you knew what to listen for, were 6 distinct impacts. The same rhythm, the same inexplicable cadence. Over the next 3 weeks, the pattern became unavoidable. Every time I began recording Foley work, the knocks would begin, not when I was mixing vocals, not during instrumental sessions, only when I was creating physical sound effects. The timing was too precise to be coincidence, too regular to be random building noise. I started keeping a log. Session duration, time of day, atmospheric conditions, recording equipment used. The data revealed disturbing consistencies. The knocks always occurred within 90 seconds of beginning Foley work, always 6 in number, always matching whatever tempo I'd last set on the metronome. Even when I deliberately varied the rhythm, the ceiling would echo it back with mechanical precision. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed, staring at the plaster surface mere feet above my face, wondering what could possibly be up there. The rational part of my mind insisted it was pipes, maybe old heating ducts expanding and contracting, but pipes didn't respond to metronome settings. Pipes didn't count to 6 and stop. The breakthrough came when I decided to investigate properly. I'd invested in a set of contact microphones, sensitive enough to pick up vibrations through solid materials. If something was moving around up there, these would capture it. The first test session began at 2:15 a.m. I placed one contact mic at the point where the knocks seemed loudest, another at the opposite corner of the room. Then I set up my usual Foley recording, a simple footstep sequence, metronome set to 80 BPM. The knocks came right on schedule. But what I heard through the contact mics made my blood run cold. The sounds weren't coming from one location. They were coming from 2 distinct points simultaneously, points that were separated by the entire length of my room. The acoustics were impossible. Nothing could be in two places at once, creating identical sounds with perfect synchronization. I played the recording back, analyzing the waveforms on my computer screen. The two audio channels showed identical patterns, but the phase relationships indicated the sounds were occurring at exactly the same moment from sources at least 12 feet apart, in a space that supposedly didn't exist. That's when I noticed something else. The background ambient noise in the contact mic recordings contained a subtle but consistent undertone, a low-frequency hum that my regular microphones hadn't picked up. It was almost like breathing, but too regular, too mechanical, like something large cycling air through a contained space. I spent the next week obsessing over the recordings. I isolated frequencies, boosted specific ranges, filtered out everything but the anomalous sounds. The more I listened, the more convinced I became that something was living in that sealed space above me. The realization came gradually, like a photograph developing in chemical solution. The breathing sounds weren't random, they had a pattern too, a rhythm that matched my own respiratory rate during recording sessions. When I was calm, the breathing was slow and steady. When I was anxious, it quickened proportionally. I started testing the theory deliberately. I'd hyperventilate during recording sessions, then listen to the contact mic playback. Sure enough, the breathing sounds would accelerate to match my own elevated rate. I'd hold my breath, and the sounds would pause, resuming only when I exhaled. The logical explanation was that I was somehow creating these sounds myself, that the stress of overwork had triggered some kind of psychosomatic response. But that didn't account for the synchronized dual-source knocking, or the fact that the sounds occurred even when I wasn't consciously controlling my breathing. I began to feel watched, not just during recording sessions, but constantly. The sensation would start as soon as I entered the studio room, a prickly awareness that something was observing me from above. I'd catch myself glancing at the ceiling repeatedly, searching for signs of movement or disturbance that never came. My work suffered. Clients complained that my usually pristine audio tracks now contained subtle background artifacts, faint knocking sounds that hadn't been there during recording but somehow appeared in the final mix. I'd spend hours trying to clean them out, but they seemed to regenerate themselves, always in groups of 6, always matching the tempo of whatever metronome setting I'd used. The breaking point came during a particularly challenging session. I was working on sound design for a thriller, creating the audio for a scene where the protagonist hears mysterious sounds from an inaccessible attic. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been recording for 3 hours straight, my nerves frayed from too much caffeine and too little sleep. The knocks had come and gone several times, but now they were starting to deviate from the pattern. Instead of 6, I was hearing 7 knocks, then 8, then a continuous drumming that seemed to fill the entire space above me. I grabbed the contact microphones and pressed them against the ceiling at different points, moving frantically around the room. The sounds were everywhere now, not just 2 sources, but dozens, as if something vast and segmented was moving through the sealed space with impossible fluidity. That's when I heard my own voice. It was faint, distorted by the contact microphones, but unmistakably my voice, speaking words I hadn't said. The voice was reciting numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Over and over with the same mechanical precision as the knocking. I yanked the headphones off and stumbled backward, but the voice continued, now audible through the ceiling itself. My voice, but not coming from my mouth. Coming from above, from the sealed space that couldn't possibly contain anything larger than a rat. I ran from the room and didn't return for 3 days. When I finally worked up the courage to go back, everything was normal. The ceiling showed no signs of disturbance. The contact microphones registered only standard building noise. I played back the recording from that final session, but found only the usual 6 knocks, perfectly timed, perfectly predictable. There was no trace of the voice, no evidence of the extended drumming sequence, just the same pattern that had been haunting me for weeks. I moved out of the house the following month. The landlord seemed unsurprised, mentioning that the previous tenant had also been a sound engineer who'd complained about noise issues. He'd moved out after only 6 months, claiming the building was somehow interfering with his work. I never found out what happened to the tenant before that, or the one before that. But I keep wondering about the numbers. 6 knocks, 6 months, 6 previous tenants perhaps, each one driven away by the same impossible sounds. In my new studio, I've started using digital metronomes instead of mechanical ones. I tell myself it's for convenience, but the truth is simpler. I'm afraid of what might respond to the rhythm. Sometimes late at night when I'm working alone, I still catch myself listening for that familiar pattern. 6 knocks, measured and precise, echoing from spaces that shouldn't exist. The worst part isn't the fear that it might happen again. The worst part is the growing suspicion that it never stopped happening. That somewhere above me, in the dead air between floors, something is still keeping time, still counting, still waiting for me to set the tempo so it can begin its mechanical dance. I've stopped doing Foley work entirely now. I tell clients it's a creative decision, that I'm focusing on other aspects of audio production. But the truth is that I'm afraid. Afraid that if I create those familiar sounds again, something will hear them and respond. Something that knows my voice, my breathing patterns, my rhythms. Something that's been learning to be me. Last night, I heard 6 knocks on the wall of my new apartment. The building is modern, single story, with no space above my unit. There's nowhere for the sound to come from. But I heard them anyway, and when I played back the security camera footage from the hallway, I saw something that made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. The footage showed me standing in the hallway at 3:47 a.m., raising my fist to knock on my own door. 6 times, in perfect rhythm. While I was inside, hearing the knocks from the other side. I don't remember leaving my apartment. I don't remember knocking on my own door. But there I was, moving with the same mechanical precision I'd heard in that sealed attic space, following patterns that weren't quite my own. The metronome on my desk hasn't been turned on in 3 months, but sometimes, in the silence between heartbeats, I can still hear it ticking, counting down to something I don't understand, keeping time for a performance I never agreed to join. The only question now is whether I'm the musician or the instrument. Story 11. The fluorescent lights above the wash bay flickered like dying stars, casting intermittent shadows across the concrete floor, where soap suds gathered in rainbow pools. It was 2:47 a.m., according to the digital clock on my dashboard, and I should have been home hours ago. But sleep had been elusive lately. Too many nights spent staring at the ceiling, replaying the same endless loop of patient appointments, insurance claims, and the hollow echo of my own voice explaining the same stretches, the same exercises, the same futile hope that bodies could be fixed. So I drove, through the empty streets of Albuquerque, past the closed storefronts and darkened windows, until I found myself at the 24-hour car wash on Central Avenue. The Dodge Charger needed cleaning anyway. 3 weeks of accumulated dust, and the sticky residue of a monsoon that had come and gone without bringing any real relief from the heat. The wash bay smelled of industrial soap and wet concrete, a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. I fed quarters into the machine, selected the premium cycle, and pulled the pressure wand from its holster. The water emerged in a violent spray, and I began the mechanical ritual of washing away the desert's accumulation. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was just the interplay of neon light and mist, the way water droplets caught the harsh fluorescence and created phantoms in the air. But as I moved around the car, the shape remained constant, standing just at the edge of the wash bay's illuminated circle. A human silhouette perfectly formed, made entirely of what looked like suspended rain. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The water that composed her form caught the pink and blue neon from the vacancy sign of the motel across the street, creating a prismatic effect that made her shimmer like heat distortion. But where she stood, the concrete remained completely dry. I lowered the pressure wand, and in the sudden silence, I heard it. The unmistakable screech of train brakes, metal grinding against metal, echoing from somewhere far away. The sound raised goosebumps along my arms despite the desert heat that still radiated from the asphalt. The nearest railway had been abandoned for 15 years. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, fingers clumsy with urgency. The camera app opened, and I aimed the lens at the impossible figure. But the screen showed only the empty wash bay, soap suds, and fluorescent glare. I tapped record anyway, moving the phone in slow arcs, documenting what I could see, but the device could not. The audio, however, captured everything. The distant train whistle, growing louder. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on tracks that no longer existed. And underneath it all, something else. A sound like breathing, but wrong. As if the air itself was being drawn through water. I played the recording back immediately. Static filled the video, white noise punctuated by bands of interference. But the audio was crystal clear, the phantom train approaching, and that wet, labored breathing that seemed to come from inside my own chest. When I looked up, she was closer. The figure had moved while I was distracted, now standing just outside the wash bay's perimeter. The rain that formed her body moved in slow, hypnotic patterns, droplets flowing upward in defiance of gravity, creating currents and eddies that suggested the memory of flesh and bone. Where her face should have been, the neon light scattered into fragments, making it impossible to discern features. Yet I felt the weight of her attention like a physical pressure. I forced myself to think rationally. Sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations. The mind, pushed to its limits, could conjure elaborate deceptions. I'd seen it in patients, the way chronic pain could rewire perception, making the brain interpret harmless stimuli as threats. Perhaps the stress of the past months, the mounting dissatisfaction with my work, the slow erosion of purpose, had finally reached a breaking point. But then why did my phone record the sounds? I approached the wash bay's edge, each step deliberate and measured. The figure remained motionless, her form becoming more distinct as I drew closer. I could see now that she was wearing what appeared to be a dress, the fabric suggested by the way the waterlight played across her frame, vintage, perhaps from the 1940s, with a full skirt and fitted bodice that spoke of a different era. The train sounds grew louder, more insistent. I could hear the bell now, clanging in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. The phantom locomotive seemed to be bearing down on us, though the desert stretched empty in all directions. I pressed my palms against my ears, but the sound came from within, vibrating through my bones. She turned her head toward me, and though I couldn't see her eyes, I felt them. Ancient, patient, infinitely sad. The water that formed her face rippled like a disturbed pond, and for a moment I thought I glimpsed something underneath, a glimpse of features that might have once been human. The pressure wand was still in my hand, connected to its mechanical heart by a thick rubber umbilical. Without thinking, I squeezed the trigger, sending a jet of water directly at the figure. The stream passed through her harmlessly, striking the pavement behind where she stood. But she didn't disperse or fade. Instead, she seemed to absorb the water, her form becoming more solid, more real. That's when I understood. She wasn't made of water at all. She was made of absence, the negative space where water should be, where rain should fall, where life should exist. The wash bay's harsh light revealed her not as a presence but as a void, a space in the world that had been carefully maintained by forces I couldn't comprehend. I backed away, but she matched my movement, maintaining the same distance between us. The train sounds reached a crescendo, and I could smell coal smoke and hot metal, could feel the vibration of approaching wheels through the soles of my feet. The fluorescent lights above began to strobe more rapidly, and in the intermittent darkness, I saw other shapes moving at the edges of my vision, more figures emerging from the shadows, all composed of the same impossible absence. They were passengers, I realized, waiting for a train that would never come, at a station that existed only in the spaces between reality and memory. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text message from an unknown number. The 3:15 to nowhere is now approaching. Please have your tickets ready. I looked at the screen, then at the figure before me. She had moved closer still, close enough that I could see the rain patterns that formed her hands. the way the light bent around her fingers like glass. She was reaching for something, or someone, with a gesture that spoke of desperate longing. The Charger's engine was still running, its exhaust mixing with the coal smoke I shouldn't have been able to smell. I backed toward the car, never taking my eyes off her, my hand fumbling for the door handle. But as I moved, the wash bay seemed to stretch, the distance between me and safety expanding like a funhouse mirror. More text messages appeared on my phone, all from the same unknown number. Your reservation has been confirmed. Please proceed to platform 7. The conductor will collect your fare. One way only. I deleted them as quickly as they appeared, but they kept coming, faster now, filling the screen with impossible invitations to impossible journeys. The train sounds had become deafening, and I could hear voices now, passengers calling out stations that didn't exist, conductors announcing arrivals that would never come. The rain woman was directly in front of me now, her form so close that I could feel the unnatural cold radiating from her absence. She raised her hand, and I saw that she was holding something, a ticket, white and pristine, printed with destinations written in languages that hurt to read. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, and felt the paper dissolve at my touch. But the words remained, seared into my vision. Return trip, denied. The fluorescent lights died all at once, plunging the wash bay into darkness. In the sudden silence, I heard only the Charger's engine and my own ragged breathing. When my eyes adjusted, she was gone. The wash bay was empty, normal. Nothing but soap suds and fluorescent glare. I stumbled to the car, my legs unsteady, and drove home through streets that seemed different somehow, too wide, too empty. As if the city had been hollowed out and replaced with something that only resembled the place I knew. That was 6 weeks ago. Since then, I've returned to the wash bay 17 times. Always at night, always alone. The cameras of my phone continue to record only static, but the audio captures everything. The approaching train, the station announcements, the whispered conversations of passengers who board a locomotive that exists only in the spaces between seconds. I've researched the history of the site. In 1947, there was indeed a train station here, part of the Santa Fe line. It was demolished in 1952 after an accident that killed 12 passengers when the 315 to Santa Fe derailed during a flash flood. The reports mention that the bodies were never found, washed away by the sudden torrent that turned the arroyo into a temporary river. But that's not what troubles me most. What troubles me is the growing certainty that I'm not investigating a mystery. I'm being recruited for something. The text messages have become more frequent, more insistent. They appear on my phone even when it's turned off, messages that couldn't possibly be delivered through any cellular network. Your platform assignment has been updated. Departure delayed due to weather conditions. Please report to the station house for final boarding. I've started seeing other figures in the wash bay. The passengers I glimpsed that first night, becoming more solid, more real. They wear clothes from different eras, carry luggage that looks heavy with the weight of interrupted journeys. Some appear to be from the 1940s, others from decades earlier, a few from more recent times, all of them waiting, all of them reaching for something just beyond their grasp. Last night I saw a man in a physical therapist's polo shirt, standing at the edge of the wash bay. He looked exactly like me, but his eyes held the patient sadness of someone who had been waiting for a very long time. When he saw me watching, he smiled and held up a ticket. My ticket, the one with my name printed in that impossible script, destination unknown, departure time approaching. I understand now that the wash bay isn't just a place where the impossible becomes visible. It's a station, a nexus between the world of the living and the world of the waiting. And I'm not just a witness to its mysteries. I'm being prepared for a journey I never signed up for, to a destination I can't imagine. But here's what truly terrifies me. I'm beginning to want to go. The mundane world has started to feel thin, insubstantial. My patients' pain seems distant, their recovery stories hollow. The daily routine of adjustment and manipulation, of guiding bodies back to functionality, has lost all meaning. I find myself thinking about the rain woman, about the sadness in her impossible eyes, about the train that calls to passengers who exist between one moment and the next. Tonight, I'll return to the wash bay. The messages on my phone have become more urgent. Final boarding call. All passengers must have tickets validated. The 3:15 to nowhere is now departing. I've left this account, this testimony, in case someone finds it. In case someone comes looking for an explanation of why a perfectly rational man would disappear into the fluorescent-lit nothing of a 24-hour car wash. But I suspect that whoever reads this will already know the answer. They'll have seen the rain figures themselves, felt the pull of that impossible train, heard the whispered invitations to journey beyond the boundaries of the ordinary world. The wash bay is calling, and I can no longer resist its summons. The ticket in my pocket grows warm, and I can hear the distant whistle of the 3:15 to nowhere, approaching right on schedule. Story 12. The heat signature appeared at 14:27 hours, exactly 79 years after the last B-24 Liberator had lifted off from this forgotten strip of Arizona desert. I was monitoring the thermal imaging systems during our historical reenactment when the infrared display flickered, then stabilized on a figure walking 30 yards ahead of our formation. At first I thought it was Jenkins from the advance team, but the silhouette was wrong. Too tall, too deliberate in its movements. The figure wore what appeared to be a heavy coat, strange for the desert heat that had us all sweating through our period uniforms. But the thermal signature was unmistakable, a human form radiating body heat at a steady 98.6 degrees, hands buried deep in coat pockets, walking with the unhurried gait of someone who had all the time in the world. I adjusted the settings on my equipment, a modified commercial drone system we'd been using to document the event. The image remained clear, almost unnaturally so. The figure's heat signature was stronger than it should have been, given the ambient temperature and the equipment's typical sensitivity range. I'd operated thermal imaging systems for 6 years, first in the military and now as a civilian contractor, but I'd never seen readings quite like this. "Henderson, you getting anything unusual on your end?" I called out to my colleague, who was operating the standard digital camera rig 20 feet to my left. He lowered his viewfinder and squinted at the empty runway ahead. "Like what?" "Just seeing heat mirages and a whole lot of nothing." I glanced back at my screen. The figure was still there, maintaining perfect distance from our group. It had turned slightly as if acknowledging our presence, but continued its steady march toward the control tower ruins. "Check your footage. There should be someone about 30 yards out, center of the runway." Henderson scrolled through his camera's display, then shook his head. "Nope, empty as a church on Monday. Maybe your equipment's picking up residual heat from the tarmac." But residual heat doesn't walk. It doesn't maintain a consistent human outline, and it certainly doesn't pause, turn, and change direction. As we continued our slow procession down the runway, recreating the final mission briefing march from December 1943, I kept my eyes locked on the thermal display. The figure remained constant, always the same distance ahead, moving with mechanical precision. When we veered left toward the deteriorating hangar complex, it veered left. When we stopped for the historian to explain the significance of the bomb loading procedures, it stopped too. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on our small group of volunteers, historians, and documentary crew. Sweat pooled beneath my equipment vest, and the metal components of my gear were too hot to touch directly. Yet according to my thermal sensors, the figure ahead maintained its unwavering temperature signature, showing no signs of overheating or thermal distress. Dr. Sarah Kellerman, our lead historian, was providing commentary for the documentary cameras about the psychological state of the airmen during their final missions. Her voice carried across the desolate runway, explaining how many of the pilots and crew members had experienced what we would now recognize as combat stress reactions. Some had reported seeing fellow airmen who had been lost in previous missions, walking the flight line at dawn or standing near their old aircraft. The irony wasn't lost on me. As we approached the main hangar, the figure on my screen began to slow. For the first time since I'd detected it, The thermal signature changed slightly. The outline became more defined, and I could make out additional details. The cut of the coat, the way the collar was turned up against some unfelt wind, even the suggestion of military-issue boots. "Henderson, I'm serious about checking your footage again," I said, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "There's definitely someone out there. Look, man, I've been doing this for 12 years. If there was someone walking around in this heat wearing a coat, I'd have spotted them by now. Maybe you should take a break, get some water." But I couldn't take a break. Not when the figure was beginning to turn around. The movement was slow, deliberate. The thermal signature rotated to face our direction, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw the outline of a face in the heat pattern. Not features exactly, but the suggestion of someone looking directly at me through the screen. That's when I noticed something else. We weren't moving forward anymore. I looked up from my equipment to find our group had somehow come to a stop. Dr. Kellerman was still speaking, but her words seemed to be repeating, cycling through the same information about crew psychological states. The other volunteers were standing in identical positions to where they'd been several minutes earlier, their shadows falling at the same angles despite the passing time. My chronometer read 14:33, but I was certain more time had passed. The thermal signature ahead of us had completed its turn and was now walking back in our direction. As it approached, I felt a cold sensation that had nothing to do with the desert heat. The figure passed through our formation on my screen, moving with the same steady gait, hands still in pockets. I spun around to track its movement, but Henderson was looking at me with growing concern. "What the hell are you doing?" "The figure, it just walked through us. Didn't you feel anything?" "Feel what? You're starting to worry me, man. Maybe the heat's getting to you." I checked my screen again. The thermal signature had resumed its position 30 yards ahead of our group, facing the direction we'd originally been traveling. We were moving forward again, though I couldn't remember starting to walk. Dr. Kellerman was providing the same commentary about airman stress reactions, her voice carrying the exact same inflection as before. The chronometer still read 14:33. Over the next hour, or what felt like an hour, the pattern repeated. Each time we approached the hangar, the figure would turn around, walk back through our formation, and somehow we'd find ourselves back at the starting point of our historical march. The countdown on my equipment remained frozen at 14:33, even though my phone's clock continued to advance normally. Henderson's concern evolved into outright alarm as I became increasingly agitated. He couldn't see what I was seeing, couldn't understand why I kept insisting there was someone walking ahead of us. To him, I was talking to empty air, spinning around to track invisible movement, and growing more paranoid with each cycle. "Look, I'm going to call Dr. Kellerman over here," he said during one of our stops. "You're acting like you're seeing things." "I am seeing things. That's the problem." But when Dr. Kellerman examined my thermal imaging equipment, she found nothing unusual. The readings were normal for the ambient temperature and surroundings. No human heat signatures, no anomalous thermal patterns, just the expected gradual temperature variations of sun-baked concrete and metal structures. Yet on my screen, the figure remained as clear as ever. I began to notice other details during subsequent loops. The figure's coat appeared to be leather, A2 style, regulation issue for Army Air Forces personnel. The way it carried itself suggested military bearing, a posture I recognized from my own service. Most disturbing was the consistency of every gesture, every step, every turn of the head. It was as if I was watching a recording, a thermal echo of someone who had walked this exact route countless times before. During one cycle, I managed to get closer to the figure than usual. My thermal display showed intricate details. The texture of the coat, the outline of insignia on the collar, even the suggestion of a name tag. But when I tried to read the name, the letters seemed to shift and blur, never quite resolving into readable text. The figure paused and turned toward me, and I felt a presence that made my skin crawl despite the desert heat. For a moment, the thermal signature intensified, as if the figure was trying to communicate something important. Then it resumed its walk, hands deep in pockets, leading us back to where we'd started. Henderson was documenting my behavior now, convinced I was experiencing some kind of heat-induced breakdown. The rest of the team maintained their historical narrative. apparently unaware that we were caught in some kind of temporal loop. Or maybe they were aware, and I was the only one who couldn't accept it. As the sun began to set, though my chronometer insisted it was still 14:33, I realized the figure wasn't just walking ahead of us, it was leading us. Every time we tried to proceed past a certain point, it would turn us around, guide us back to the beginning of our march, like a shepherd keeping his flock contained within safe boundaries. But safe from what? The answer came during the final loop of the day, when I noticed something else on my thermal display. Behind us, scattered across the runway at regular intervals, were dozens of other heat signatures, faint, almost transparent, but unmistakably human forms. They were standing at attention, watching our procession with patient, eternal vigilance. I understood then that we weren't just reenacting history. We were being reenacted by it. The figure in the coat wasn't preventing us from moving forward. It was preventing us from joining the others who had tried to walk this runway 79 years ago and had never found their way back. As we loaded our equipment into the vehicles at the end of the day, Henderson expressed his relief that we were finally leaving. He'd edited his footage and found nothing unusual, just hours of empty runway and my increasingly erratic behavior. But I knew better. When I checked my thermal imaging equipment one final time before packing it away, the figure was still there, still walking, still maintaining its eternal patrol of the runway, hands in pockets, keeping the living separate from the dead. The chronometer finally clicked over to 14:34. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain what I saw that day, or if I'd want to. Henderson filed a report expressing concern about my mental state, and I was quietly reassigned to desk duty pending a psychological evaluation. The official explanation was heat exhaustion combined with equipment malfunction, but sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing thermal imaging protocols, I find myself wondering about those other heat signatures I glimpsed on the runway. How many of them had been pilots and crew members who had walked that same route in 1943? How many had been participants in previous historical reenactments who had somehow gotten lost in the endless loop of their own making? And most disturbing of all, how many of them had been people like me, who had seen the figure in the coat and understood, too late, that some echoes are too strong to ignore? The thermal signature is still there, I'm certain of it, still walking, still watching, still guiding anyone who gets too close back to the safety of the beginning, where the living belong. But I'm no longer sure which side of that boundary I'm on. Story 13. The grandfather clock in the foyer struck 11, its brass pendulum catching the amber light from the chandelier I'd managed to coax back to life after 3 weeks of rewiring. I'd been scrubbing grease stains from the commercial range when the sound reached me, a distant melody threading through the walls of the Blackwood mansion like smoke through cracks in old plaster. Piano music. I set down my steel wool and listened, my hands still slick with degreaser. The melody was unfamiliar yet haunting, something that belonged to an era when women wore gloves to dinner and men carried pocket watches. But I was alone in this sprawling Victorian, had been alone since signing the lease papers that made me the first tenant in decades. The music grew louder, accompanied now by the whisper of what sounded like shuffling feet and the crystalline chime of laughter. I checked my watch. 11:07 p.m. The sounds were coming from the dining room, just beyond the butler's pantry that separated my new kitchen from the mansion's formal entertaining space. I'd spent the better part of a month transforming the old servant's kitchen into something resembling a modern culinary workspace, though the mansion's bones remained stubbornly rooted in 1900. The cast iron stove dominated one wall, its surface large enough to accommodate a dozen pans. Original tin ceilings stretched 12 feet overhead, and the wide plank floors creaked stories with every step. But I'd never heard music before tonight. Moving carefully across the kitchen's wooden floor, I approached the swinging door that led to the butler's pantry. The melody continued, now clearly identifiable as big band swing, the kind of music that made you think of speakeasies and cigarette smoke and women in beaded dresses. Through the frosted glass panels of the pantry door, I could see light flickering in the dining room beyond. I pushed through the pantry and pressed my ear against the dining room door. The music was louder now, accompanied by the rustle of fabric and the soft percussion of feet moving across hardwood. Someone was in there. Multiple someones from the sound of it. The door had a keyhole, brass tarnished to dark amber. I knelt and peered through. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The dining room was alive with movement. Silhouettes in evening wear glided across the floor in elegant patterns, their forms cast in shadow by candlelight I hadn't lit. The massive mahogany table had been pushed against the far wall, creating a dance floor where couples swayed to the music. And at the room's center, positioned where the table usually stood, was a baby grand piano. The pianist sat with her back to me, her dark hair catching the light like polished obsidian. Her fingers moved across the keys with practiced grace, coaxing melodies that seemed to make the very air shimmer. Around her, the dancers moved in synchronization, their movements fluid and timeless. I watched, transfixed, until the pianist's head turned slightly, as if she'd sensed my presence. In that moment, her fingers stilled on the keys. The music stopped. The dancers froze. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the scene vanished. The room fell into darkness, leaving only the faint scent of gardenia and the echo of silence. I fumbled for the light switch, my hands shaking as I illuminated the dining room. Empty. The table stood in its usual position, surrounded by chairs I'd covered with dust sheets. No piano, no dancers, no lingering warmth from the candles I'd seen flickering moments before. But the floorboards showed scuff marks where feet had moved in patterns I didn't remember making. Sleep was impossible after that. I paced the kitchen, checking the locks on every door, examining windows for signs of intrusion. The mansion felt different now, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. Every creak of the old wood, every whisper of wind through the eaves, seemed loaded with significance. By dawn, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined it all. Stress from the move, exhaustion from the renovation work, the isolation of living alone in a house built for entertaining dozens. These were reasonable explanations for what I'd experienced. The mind could play tricks, especially in a place like this. But the next night, at precisely 11:07 p.m., it happened again. This time, I was ready. I'd positioned myself in the butler's pantry before 11, armed with a flashlight and a small digital recorder. The music began as it had before, piano melody drifting through the walls like a familiar perfume. I crept to the keyhole and peered through. The scene was identical to the previous night. The same couples dancing in the same patterns, the same pianist with her obsidian hair, the same ethereal candlelight. But this time, I noticed details I'd missed before. The women's dresses were from the 1920s, with dropped waists and beaded fringe that caught the light as they moved. The men wore white tie and tails, and the piano, I could see now that it was a Steinway, its ebony surface polished to mirror brightness. I pressed the record button on my device, but the LED display showed no activity. No sound was being captured, despite the music that filled my ears. The pianist continued to play, her fingers dancing across keys that made no impression on my recording equipment. Once again, she turned, sensing my observation. Our eyes met through the keyhole, dark eyes that seemed to hold depths I couldn't fathom. She smiled, an expression both welcoming and infinitely sad, before the scene dissolved into darkness. The third night brought variations. The music was different, a waltz this time, slow and haunting. The dancers moved accordingly, their steps more formal, more structured. I began to recognize individual faces among the silhouettes, though I couldn't place where I might have seen them before. It was during the fourth night that I remembered the basement. I'd explored the mansion's lower level only once, during my initial tour with the rental agent. The basement was a maze of servants' quarters, storage rooms, and what appeared to be a wine cellar. But there had been another room, one the agent had glossed over quickly, a storage area filled with boxes and furniture covered in sheets. The next morning, I descended the narrow staircase with a flashlight, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. The basement smelled of mildew and old wood, with an underlying sweetness that reminded me of flowers left too long in water. I found the storage room after several false turns through the maze of corridors. The room was larger than I'd remembered, filled with the detritus of decades. Furniture huddled under dust covers like sleeping ghosts. Boxes were stacked against the walls, their contents unknown. But in the far corner, I discovered what I was looking for. A steamer trunk, its brass corners green with age, sat beneath a collection of picture frames. The lock was broken, and the lid opened easily. Inside, I found programs, dozens of them, printed on heavy paper that had yellowed with age. The Blackwood Mansion Gala series, they read. 1923, 1929. I spread the programs across the floor, examining them by flashlight. Each announced a different event: the Spring Cotillion, the Harvest Ball, the New Year's Eve Spectacular. The programs included photographs of the mansion's main rooms, transformed for entertaining. And there, in a photograph dated 1925, was the dining room I'd been spying on. The image showed the massive table pushed against the wall, exactly as I'd seen it. Couples in evening wear posed in dance formation around a baby grand piano. And at the piano bench, her dark hair gleaming in the camera's flash, sat a woman whose face I now recognized. The pianist. According to the program, her name was Vivian Thorne, and she was described as the mansion's resident musical talent and a treasure of the Savannah social scene. The program for the final gala, dated December 31st, 1929, included a special note. This evening marks the end of an era. The Blackwood Mansion Gala series concludes with gratitude to all who have made these gatherings possible. I studied the photograph of Vivian Thorne, comparing it to the face I'd seen through the keyhole. The resemblance was unmistakable, but that was impossible. The woman in the photograph would be over a century old if she were still alive. That night, I approached the dining room door with new purpose. At exactly 11:07 p.m., the music began. A foxtrot this time, lively and complex. I peered through the keyhole and found the familiar scene. Dancers in period dress, candlelight flickering, and Vivian Thorne at the piano. But something was different. The dancers seemed more solid, more real. The music was clearer, as if a veil had been lifted from my perception. And when Vivian turned to look at me, her expression was more knowing, more direct. She stood from the piano bench, her fingers trailing across the keys in a final flourish. The music stopped, but the dancers didn't vanish. Instead, they turned toward the door where I crouched, their faces expectant. Vivian walked across the dance floor, her beaded dress catching the light with each step. She approached the door and knelt on the opposite side, bringing her face level with the keyhole. We stared at each other through the brass opening, and I could see every detail of her features. The curve of her lips, the arch of her eyebrows, the intelligence in her dark eyes. She mouthed words I couldn't hear, but her meaning was clear. "Join us." I jerked away from the keyhole, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I looked again, the room was empty, though I could swear I heard the echo of laughter fading into the mansion's depths. The next day, I researched the Blackwood Mansion's history at the Savannah Historical Society. The records painted a picture of a golden age of entertaining that ended abruptly in 1929. The mansion had been sold after that, changing hands multiple times before falling into disrepair. Most of the staff had been dismissed, and the elaborate parties that had defined the house's social significance simply stopped. But I found no record of what had happened to Vivian Thorne, no obituary, no mention of her departure. According to the records, she had simply vanished after the final gala, as if she'd never existed at all. That night, I didn't go to the keyhole. Instead, I stayed in my kitchen, trying to focus on prep work for the small catering business I was attempting to launch. But at 11:07 p.m., the music began again, a waltz this time, slower and more insistent than before. I tried to ignore it, but the melody seemed to seep through the walls, filling the kitchen with its haunting beauty. My hand stilled on the knife I was using to dice vegetables. The music was so clear now, so present, that I could almost feel the notes vibrating through the floorboards. Unable to resist, I crept to the butler's pantry and pressed my ear against the dining room door. The music was louder than ever, accompanied by the rustle of silk and the soft percussion of dancing feet. But there was something else now, a voice, barely audible, weaving through the melody like a silver thread. Vivian was singing. Her voice was low and smoky, shaped by an accent I couldn't place. The words were unclear, but the emotion was unmistakable. Longing, invitation, and something deeper that made my chest tighten with an inexplicable sadness. I found myself reaching for the door handle, my fingers closing around the cold brass. The metal felt solid, real, more substantial than anything I'd touched in days. The music continued, growing stronger, more insistent. The handle turned easily in my grip. I pushed the door open and stepped into the dining room. The scene that greeted me was exactly as I'd observed through the keyhole, but now I was part of it. The dancers moved around me in their eternal patterns, their faces serene and welcoming. The candlelight was warm against my skin, casting dancing shadows on the walls. And at the piano, Vivian Thorne smiled at me with recognition and what might have been relief. She gestured to the empty space beside her on the piano bench, her invitation clear. The music continued, but now I could hear it properly. Not just the melody, but the harmony, the rhythm, the subtle interplay of notes that made the waltz complete. I took a step toward her, then another. The dancers parted to create a path, their movements graceful and synchronized. Vivian's smile widened, and for the first time since I'd moved into the mansion, I felt truly welcome. But as I approached the piano, I caught a glimpse of myself in the darkened window. The reflection showed me alone in an empty room, arms outstretched toward nothing, swaying to music that existed only in my mind. The realization hit me like cold water. I stumbled backward, my rational mind reasserting itself. This was impossible. None of this was real. I was alone in a house that had been empty for decades, talking to people who existed only in old photographs and faded programs. The scene flickered, like a candle in a sudden draft. The dancers wavered, their forms becoming translucent. Vivian's smile faltered, and her expression shifted to something that might have been disappointment, or perhaps understanding. I turned and ran from the dining room, slamming the door behind me. In the kitchen, I grabbed my phone and called the only number I could think of. Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist I'd known in culinary school who now practiced in Atlanta. Her voice was groggy with sleep, but she listened as I explained what had been happening. The nightly music, the dancers, the pianist who invited me to join her eternal gala. I told her about the stress of the move, the isolation, the long hours I'd been putting in to renovate the kitchen. Dr. Chen's response was professionally gentle but clear. What I was experiencing sounded like a combination of stress-induced hallucinations and isolation psychosis. The brain, she explained, could create elaborate scenarios to cope with loneliness and environmental stressors. Old houses, with their unfamiliar sounds and atmospheric quirks, were particularly effective at triggering such episodes. She recommended that I leave the mansion immediately and stay with friends until we could arrange for a proper evaluation. The isolation was clearly affecting my mental health, and continuing to live alone in such an environment could lead to a more serious breakdown. I hung up the phone and looked around the kitchen I'd worked so hard to restore. The cast iron stove gleamed under the pendant lights I'd installed. The wide plank floors showed the wear patterns of decades of use. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, solid and real and completely normal. But from the dining room came the faint sound of piano music, and I knew that at 11:07 p.m. tomorrow night, Vivian Thorne would be waiting for me to join her eternal celebration. I packed my bags that night and left the mansion before dawn. The moving truck arrived the next afternoon to collect my equipment and furniture. I found a small apartment in downtown Savannah and began the process of rebuilding my life and my sanity. But sometimes late at night when the city is quiet and the world feels thin, I hear piano music drifting on the wind. And I wonder if Vivian Thorne still plays her nightly concerts in the empty dining room, waiting for someone to accept her invitation to dance. The rational part of my mind insists it was all a psychological break, a stress response to isolation and change. But the programs I found in the basement, the ones that documented the mansion's golden age and featured photographs of a pianist who looked exactly like the woman I'd seen, Those programs had been real. I'd touched them, studied them, used them to research the mansion's history. When I called the Historical Society to return them, however, they had no record of the Blackwood Mansion Gala series. According to their files, the mansion had never hosted regular entertainment events. There had been no pianist named Vivian Thorne, no elaborate parties, no golden age of socializing. The programs, like the music and the dancers, seemed to exist only in the space between reality and imagination, in the twilight realm where memory and longing intersect with the echoes of what might have been. I never returned to the mansion, but I drive past it sometimes on my way to catering jobs in the historic district. The windows are dark, the gardens overgrown, and a for-lease sign swings gently in the breeze. But on certain nights, when the conditions are right and the veil between worlds grows thin, I swear I can see the faint glow of candlelight in the dining room windows. And I know that somewhere in that empty house, Vivian Thorne continues her eternal performance, playing melodies that exist only in the space between sanity and madness, between the living and the dead, between what was and what might have been. The invitation remains open, floating on the night air like a half-remembered dream, waiting for someone brave enough or broken enough to accept it and join the dance that never ends. Story 14. The blue glow from my monitor had become a second sun in the cramped apartment, casting everything in harsh, artificial light. 3 a.m. pressed against the windows like a living thing, and I could feel Seattle's rain beginning to tap against the glass with increasing urgency. The prototype wasn't cooperating. 17 hours of debugging had left me hollow-eyed and running on nothing but coffee and stubborn determination. The game was supposed to be simple, a horror experience where players explored an abandoned house, collecting memories scattered throughout the rooms. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd been living like a ghost myself these past weeks, haunting my own apartment in pursuit of perfect code. My fingers moved across the keyboard with mechanical precision, adjusting lighting parameters and collision detection, while the rest of Seattle slept. Grandma's photograph watched me from the bookshelf, her weathered face caught in that familiar half-smile she wore when she thought nobody was looking. The silver frame reflected my monitor's glow, creating the illusion that her eyes were lit from within. I'd kept that picture there since moving to the city 2 years ago, a reminder of simpler times when the biggest mystery in my life was whether she'd hidden cookies somewhere in her kitchen. The apartment felt smaller tonight, as if the walls had crept closer while I wasn't paying attention. Every sound seemed amplified: the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rumble of late-night traffic, the soft whisper of air moving through the heating vents. I told myself it was just fatigue, just the peculiar hyper-awareness that comes with prolonged concentration and too much caffeine. The first sign that something was wrong came when my headphones went silent. Not the gradual fade of dying batteries or the sharp pop of a loose connection, just sudden, complete silence that made my ears ring. I pulled them off, expecting to hear the ambient sounds of the city, but the apartment had gone eerily quiet. Even the refrigerator's hum had stopped. I glanced at the clock. 3:17 a.m. The rain had stopped too, leaving behind an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. That's when the TV died. The screen went black with a soft electronic sigh, and for a moment, I saw only darkness. Then, slowly, an image began to form in the black glass, not from the TV itself, but reflected from somewhere behind me. Grandma's photograph, visible in the screen's surface, seemed larger than it should be, clearer than the ambient light would allow. Her eyes appeared to be looking directly at me, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Seattle weather. I turned around, but the photograph sat exactly where it always had, unchanged and innocent. When I looked back at the TV screen, there was nothing there but my own reflection, pale and drawn, looking every bit as haunted as I felt. The electrical system began to fail piece by piece. First, the outlets near the kitchenette started making soft crackling sounds, like Rice Krispies settling in milk. Then the ones by the window joined in, followed by the strip behind my desk. The crackling grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to push through the wiring itself. The lights flickered once, twice, then settled into an irregular strobe that made everything look like a vintage film reel. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and started checking the circuit breakers, but they all looked normal. The crackling continued, spreading from outlet to outlet like a contagion. I pressed my ear to the wall near the worst of it, and I could swear I heard something moving inside the walls. Not the scurrying of mice or the settling of old wood, but something purposeful. Something that seemed to be following the electrical pathways through the building. The smell of ozone filled the air, sharp and metallic, the way it smells just before lightning strikes. My computer monitor flickered but stayed on, the blue glow now the only steady light in the apartment. The prototype was still running, my avatar frozen in the middle of the digital house's living room, surrounded by the scattered memories I'd been programming. I sat back down at my desk, partly to continue working, and partly because the familiar weight of the chair made me feel slightly more grounded. The code scrolled past on the screen, line after line of carefully crafted logic that would bring my virtual world to life. I'd been working on the dialogue system, programming the way characters would interact with objects and memories throughout the house. That's when I saw the first comment. "Don't leave lights on in empty rooms, dear. Waste of electricity." I stared at the line, my coffee growing cold in my hands. I hadn't written that comment. I was meticulous about my code documentation, but I never wrote in that conversational tone. I used technical language, abbreviated notes to myself about function parameters and optimization strategies. This sounded like something Grandma would say. I deleted the line and continued scrolling, but 3 functions down, I found another. "Turn off the TV when nobody's watching. It's burning money." My hands began to shake slightly as I scrolled faster through the code. More comments appeared, scattered throughout the file like breadcrumbs leading deeper into a forest I didn't recognize. "Close the refrigerator door quickly. Cold air costs more than you think. And unplug appliances when you're not using them. They draw power even when they're off. And don't run the dishwasher unless it's full. Water and electricity both cost money." Each comment was written in the same conversational tone, the same voice I'd heard countless times during childhood visits to Grandma's house. She'd been obsessed with saving money, with conserving resources, with making every penny count. These were the exact phrases she'd repeated like mantras. The same advice she'd given me every time I'd been careless with a light switch or left the water running while brushing my teeth. But I hadn't written these comments. I was certain of it. The crackling from the outlets grew louder, more urgent, as if responding to my discovery. The lights flickered more rapidly, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. I saved the file and opened the project's revision history, trying to trace when these comments had been added. The timestamps showed them appearing throughout the night, inserted into the code while I'd been working. But that was impossible. I'd been the only one touching the keyboard, the only one in the apartment. The comments had been added in real time, slipping into my code like thoughts I didn't remember thinking. I scrolled back to the beginning of the file, and there, at the very top, was a comment I definitely hadn't written. "Hello, sweetheart. I've been watching you work so hard." The temperature in the apartment seemed to drop 10 degrees. I could see my breath misting in the blue glow of the monitor, and the crackling from the outlets had evolved into something that almost sounded like whispering. The voices were too soft to understand, but there was a rhythmic quality to them, like a conversation happening just beyond the range of human hearing. I stood up from my desk and walked to the window, trying to ground myself in the reality of the sleeping city below. The streetlights cast pools of yellow illumination on the wet asphalt, and occasional cars passed by with the soft hiss of tires on pavement. Everything outside looked normal, peaceful even, but the reflection in the window glass showed a different story. Behind me, Grandma's photograph seemed to glow with its own light, the silver frame catching and amplifying the strobing overhead lights. Her face in the reflection looked more animated than it should, as if she were trying to speak, trying to communicate something urgent. When I turned around to look directly at the picture, it appeared normal, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I returned to my computer and opened a new file, typing quickly, "If someone is reading this, something is wrong with my code. Comments are appearing that I didn't write. They sound like my grandmother who died 3 years ago. The electrical system is failing, and I feel like I'm being watched. I saved the file and was about to close it when new text appeared below my words, typing itself out in real time. I'm not gone, sweetheart. I'm just in a different place now. The house you're building in your game reminds me of mine. I lived there for 47 years, and I learned how to save every penny, how to make everything last. I'm trying to teach you the same lessons. My hands jerked away from the keyboard as if it had become electrified. The words continued appearing without any input from me. You work too hard, stay up too late. You're wasting electricity, wasting money. The lights have been on for hours and you haven't turned off that game machine in days. I raised you better than this. The crackling from the outlets had synchronized into a rhythm that almost sounded like Morse code. The lights flickered in time with the text appearing on screen, as if the entire electrical system had become a conduit for this impossible communication. I could smell something else now, underneath the ozone, the faint scent of lavender and mothballs that had always clung to Grandma's clothes. I can see you from here, sweetheart. See how tired you are, how pale. You need to take better care of yourself, and you need to stop wasting so much power. It's expensive, and it's not good for the environment either. The text paused, and I could almost hear her voice in the stillness of the apartment. The same gentle but firm tone she'd used when correcting my childhood mistakes. When the typing resumed, it came faster, more urgent. The other tenants are complaining about the electrical problems. Your computer is drawing too much power, pulling energy from the whole building. You need to turn it off and go to bed. You need to rest. I looked around the apartment, suddenly aware of every electronic device. The monitor, the computer tower, the microwave's digital clock, the cable box under the dead TV. Each one had LED indicators that glowed like tiny eyes in the darkness, and I could swear they were all pulsing in unison, synchronized with the rhythm of the crackling outlets. I'm not trying to scare you, dear. I'm trying to help you, the same way I always did. But you're not listening. You never listened when I told you to turn off the lights, to unplug things when you weren't using them. You thought it was just old-fashioned penny pinching, but I knew things you didn't. The smell of lavender grew stronger, and I could almost feel her presence behind me, the way she used to stand over my shoulder when I was playing video games as a child, gently suggesting that maybe I'd played enough for one day. The sensation was so vivid that I turned around, expecting to see her there, but found only the empty apartment and her photograph, still reflecting the monitor's glow. I learned things during those 47 years in that house, sweetheart. Learned how electricity works, how it flows, how it can be redirected. I learned that energy never really dies, it just changes form. And I learned that if you're careful, if you're patient, you can follow those pathways to places you never imagined. The text was appearing faster now, almost faster than I could read it. The crackling had evolved into something that definitely sounded like whispers. Multiple voices all talking at once in a language I couldn't quite understand. The light strobed more rapidly, creating a nauseating strobe effect that made my head pound. Turn off the computer, sweetheart. Unplug it. Go to bed. You can work on your game tomorrow, when the sun is out, and you don't need so many lights. This is costing you money, and it's costing me energy I can't afford to waste. I reached for the power button, but my hand stopped inches away from the computer case. What if turning it off meant cutting the connection? What if this was really happening, and powering down would strand her in whatever digital limbo she'd found herself in? The rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, that grief and sleep deprivation were creating elaborate hallucinations. But the comments in my code were too specific, too perfectly in her voice. I can't stay much longer, dear. It takes so much power to reach you like this, and the building's electrical system isn't designed for this kind of load. But I need you to promise me something. Promise me you'll take better care of yourself. Promise me you'll remember what I taught you about saving money, about not wasting resources. The monitor flickered, and for a moment, I saw not my code, but a reflection of Grandma's kitchen. The same avocado green appliances and worn linoleum I remembered from childhood. She was there, standing at the stove, her back to me, wearing the same flower print dress she'd been buried in. She turned around, and her eyes were the same warm brown I remembered, but they were also somehow filled with the blue glow of my computer screen. "Don't forget me, sweetheart, but don't keep me plugged in either. Let me rest." The image faded, leaving only my reflection in the dark screen. The crackling from the outlets stopped abruptly, and the lights steadied into their normal warm glow. The apartment's familiar sounds returned, the refrigerator humming, the soft whisper of air through the vents, the distant sound of traffic on the wet streets below. I sat in the sudden silence for a long time, staring at the screen where my code had been. The comments were still there, every single one of them, but they looked different now, less like intrusions and more like gentle reminders. I scrolled through them again, reading each piece of advice about saving electricity, about turning off unused appliances, about not wasting resources. At the bottom of the file, one final comment had appeared. "I love you, sweetheart. Now turn off the computer and get some sleep." I looked at Grandma's photograph one last time. In the steady light, it looked exactly like what it was. A picture of a woman who died 3 years ago, captured in silver frame and fond memory. But there was something in her expression that seemed more peaceful now, more content, as if she'd finally said what she'd been trying to say. I saved the file, backed up my work, and shut down the computer. The apartment fell into darkness, lit only by the city lights filtering through the rain-streaked windows. I unplugged the monitor, the computer tower, and every other electronic device in the room, following advice I'd heard countless times, but never really heeded. In the morning, I would examine the code again, searching for rational explanations, power surges, corrupted files, the strange tricks that exhaustion can play on the mind. I would find logical reasons for everything that had happened, convince myself that grief and overwork had created an elaborate hallucination. But I would also keep those comments in my code, every single one of them, like digital breadcrumbs leading back to a voice I'd thought I'd lost forever. And I would remember to turn off the lights when I left a room, to unplug appliances when I wasn't using them, to take better care of myself and the resources I'd been given. Because somewhere in the spaces between electrical current and memory, between code and consciousness, I could still feel her watching over me, making sure I didn't waste anything. Not electricity, not money, and certainly not the precious time I'd been given to remember her voice. The rain continued to fall against the windows, and I finally went to bed, leaving the apartment dark and quiet, every circuit properly disconnected, every pathway to the impossible safely closed. At least I hoped they were closed. When I woke up 6 hours later, I found my coffee maker had turned itself on, filling the apartment with the rich aroma of fresh coffee and the gentle sound of percolating water. The digital clock on the microwave was flashing 12, as if the power had gone out and come back on during the night. And on my computer screen, which I was certain I'd turned off, a single line of text glowed softly in the darkness. "Good morning, sweetheart." I made coffee. I stood in the doorway, watching the cursor blink patiently after those words, and I realized that some conversations are never really finished. Some connections run deeper than electrical circuits, deeper than the rational boundaries between the living and the dead. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat down at my computer. The screen was still dark except for that single comment, waiting for my response. I placed my fingers on the keyboard and typed, "Good morning, Grandma. Thank you for the coffee, and thank you for watching over me." The cursor blinked once, twice, and then the screen went dark. But the coffee was perfect, exactly the way she used to make it, and I knew that somewhere in the spaces between memory and electricity, she was smiling. I spent the rest of the morning working on my game, adding new features and fixing bugs. But I left every one of her comments exactly where they were. They reminded me to take breaks, to turn off unnecessary lights, to be mindful of the energy I was using. They reminded me that love finds a way to bridge any gap, even the one between the living and the dead. And when the sun finally broke through Seattle's perpetual clouds, filling my apartment with natural light, I turned off my monitor and went outside for the first time in days. The city looked different somehow, more alive, more connected, as if I were seeing it through eyes that had learned to appreciate the intricate networks that bind us all together. I walked to the corner store and bought flowers, lavender, because they reminded me of her. When I returned to the apartment, I placed them next to her photograph, and I could swear I saw her smile grow a little wider in the silver frame. The game was finished a week later. It was a simple horror story about a house filled with memories, where players could explore rooms and interact with objects left behind by the previous inhabitants. The critics called it innovative, praising the way the narrative seemed to adapt to each player's choices, the way the house itself felt alive and responsive. They never knew about the comments hidden in the code, the gentle reminders about saving electricity and taking care of oneself. They never knew that somewhere in the game's digital architecture, a grandmother's love continued to watch over everyone who played, making sure they didn't waste anything precious, especially time. And every night, when I shut down my computer and unplugged the monitor, I whispered a quiet thank you to the darkness, knowing that somewhere in the spaces between circuits and memory, she was still listening, still caring, still teaching me how to save the things that really mattered. The electricity bill arrived a week later, and for the first time in months, it was lower than the previous month. I smiled as I filed it away, hearing her voice in my memory. Every penny counts, sweetheart. Every penny counts. In the end, I suppose that's what love really is. The willingness to cross any boundary, to find any pathway, to ensure that the people we care about are taking care of themselves. Even if it means rewiring the entire building to get their attention. Even if it means leaving permanent comments in their code, gentle reminders that echo through every line of programming, every decision, every moment of their electronic lives. Even if it means learning to speak in the language of electricity itself. Finding new ways to say the same old truths. Turn off the lights, unplug what you're not using, take care of yourself, and remember that I love you. The apartment has been quiet since then, in the way that healthy places are quiet, filled with the comfortable sounds of normal life, rather than the oppressive silence of isolation. But sometimes, when I'm working late and the city grows still around me, I can still hear the faint whisper of electricity moving through the walls, carrying messages I'm only beginning to understand. And I always remember to turn off the lights.